bueno cuando lo hacemos, yeah. En ti me puse a pensar, entonces ahora ya quiero sonar conmigo estás. Sé que te sientes igual y extrañas cuando encima me brincas. Porque yo soy tu veneno, yeah. Te hago pero qué bueno que lo hacemos, yeah. En ti me puse a pensar, entonces ahora ya quiero sonar conmigo estás. Sé que te sientes igual y extrañas cuando te digas algo con mis canciones, te ponías creativa, aumentando posiciones, ahora el que te lo pone se vuelve loco cuando hace que tú me menciones. Mujer, dile que a mí me perdone, no es culpa mía, te andes celando por lo del otro día. Si te lo digo a ti como se suponía, me tienes en vela desde la despedida y yo ya no duermo de noche en el velo. Si tú me das una pista como vuelo, mami, yo caliente tu hielo, y yo cancelo los pelos. Me tienes recordando todo lo que te hacía, no entiendo cómo un polvo de eso se olvida. Bandía, estoy detrás de ti como policía, lo que estoy para ti, pero igual a mí ya me pusiste los frenos. Porque yo soy tu veneno, yeah. Te hago pero qué bueno cuando lo hacemos, yeah. En ti me puse a pensar, entonces ahora ya quiero sonar conmigo estás. Sé que te sientes igual y extrañas cuando el negocio es socio. Ey, está rompiendo abajo, ya. Jaiko, como Musti, let go.
Not gonna change, I know that you like that. You know where my mind's at. Can't be tamed, I'm not gonna play. Oh no, I ain't like that. Fuck him, I'm a wildcat. Baby, break my heart, give me all you got. I'm not why, don't be shy. Is it love or lust? I can't get enough. I'm not why, don't be shy.
Bueno, muy buenos días para todos. Buenos días para todos. Espero que estén bien. Espero que estén muy bien en el día de hoy. Aquí tenemos, señores, en pantalla el SPY, Mercados Financieros. Vamos a ver cómo viene esto el día de hoy. El mercado no se muestra en un pre-market alcista. Todavía estamos tranquilos. Estamos en vela diaria a las 9:27 de la mañana. Ya estamos a punto de iniciar. Hoy tendremos nuevamente la intervención de Powell a las 10 de la mañana. El 10 de la mañana estará hablando el señor Jerome Powell y estaremos en en vivo hasta que Powell se calle. Desde que empieza a hablar hasta que Powell se calle. A ver, tuvimos aquí recientemente ya en el calendario económico, tuvimos resultados a las 8:15 de la mañana. El cambio de empleo no agrícola se dispara, señores, se dispara. Antes de una recesión, el mercado laboral se hace más fuerte. Antes de una recesión, el inventario inmobiliario crece exponencialmente. Y hay que tener eso en cuenta. Antes de una recesión, la curva de tipos de intereses se invierte. Así que muy al pendiente, muy al pendiente de la accesibilidad a adquirir nuevas casas está bajando. El bono del tesoro está casi en el 5%. La última vez que sucedió esto fue justo antes de la gran crisis financiera en el año 2008. ¿Ok? Así que hay que tener eso en cuenta. Vamos a mirarlo un momentico. Vamos a mirarlo un momento. A ver, vamos a ver. Voy a buscarlo por acá. Está por aquí. UST 2Y, UST, perdón. Oh. Espérame. Yo no lo encuentro por aquí. A ver si lo encontramos por acá. No. Ahorita lo encontramos. Acaba de abrir la bolsa, señores, 9:30 de la mañana. Abre la bolsa. Podemos ver quizás movimiento tranquilo en la mañana. Por lo menos en esta media hora yo espero un movimiento tranquilo. La candela viene a las 10 de la mañana. De 10 de la mañana es que se enciende la candela, señores. A las 10 de la mañana es que yo veo que se va a encender la candela. Todavía estamos en un movimiento tranquilo. La gran pregunta es, ¿caerá todo el día de hoy? ¿Será que todo va a caer el día de hoy? ¿Ah? ¿Será posible que todo caiga el día de hoy, señores? ¿Será eso posible? Están llegando. Saludos a nuestro querido Máximo, Flor, nuestra querida Lilia, ahí están conectados en YouTube. No sé quién más está por ahí. Nos esté saludando a través de nuestro en vivo el día de hoy. El día de hoy. Así que ahí estamos a expectativas. Estamos expectantes. Tranquilos. Observando. Mirando. Vamos a bajarnos a temporalidad de 5 minutos a ver cómo está esto. Proyecciones de onda de Elliot hasta ahorita, zona de 400 en temporalidad de 5 minutos. La Lady, buen día. Siddhartha, buen día. Ercilio, buen día. Nos tenemos por acá, hasta ahorita proyección de onda de Elliot al punto C. Aproximadamente ahí a esa parte, ¿sí? Ahí está haciendo alcista, señores, lleva velocidad, alcista el mercado. Me preparé una buena taza de café. Una señora taza de café, ¿vieron? Para esperar al tío Pau. Estará Johnny Gutiérrez por ahí, que de pronto le trae al tío Powell una tacita de café. Primo con fuerza alcista, me gusta, ¿por qué no? Me gusta abrir con fuerza alcista, buscando a ver qué vamos a tener después de las 10 de la mañana. Después de las 10 de la mañana veremos a ver qué pasa. Vamos a ver qué pasa cuando Powell empieza a hablar. Estos 5 minutos del mercado, abrimos con fuerza alcista, estamos tranquilos. Vamos a analizar cómo está todo. El SPX en estos momentos también abre en un área muy interesante. Muy interesante. Quizás hubo mucha venta el día de ayer. El día de ayer hubo mucha venta ahí en esa área del 3.986. Ahorita están realizando compras. Aquí en esta parte. Uno de los puntos más negociados Uno de los puntos más negociados ayer fue esta zona de acá, la zona del 4050, que fue donde se desató la bajada, ¿no? Esa caída fuertemente, esa caída fuerte que estuvimos experimentando el día de ayer. Y que estamos ahí mirando a ver qué tendremos. Ahí estamos encontrando un poquito de rechazo en 5 minutos. No hay problema, estamos encontrando un poco de rechazo en 5 minutos. A ver, ¿qué tenemos por aquí? Acá, encontrando un punto de rechazo. Encontramos un poco de rechazo. Estamos tranquilos. A ver, el White también está en un área muy interesante de soporte. Y ese 389. Perdón, ese 398, no 389. Ya estoy viendo, ya alterando los números. Ese 398 es de negociación. Debemos utilizarlo como soporte. Ahí debe estar nuestro bote salvavidas si queremos ver un mercado alcista. Ahí está nuestro bote salvavidas, ¿no? Vamos a ver cómo abre el Dow Jones, que ayer estuvo perdiendo 500 y tantos de puntos. Después de esa caída, parece que él se calma un poco. Una primera predicción en la zona de los 32.968. Vamos a ver, una onda A. Podemos estar mirando eso ahí. Veamos el QQQ representativo del Nasdaq. Ahí estamos viendo entonces que esta apertura, wow, después de una onda A en 5 minutos podemos estar llegando aquí. Necesitamos superar de pronto la zona del 297, 298, 297, 298 para continuar una sección alcista. Ahí en esa parte para el día. También se está soportando muy bien para el Russell 2000. No, Russell 2000 está en un doble piso. Estamos ahorita en una zona doble piso. Vamos a ver cómo se negocia ese Russell 2000 ahí, en zona de doble piso. En esa zona de doble piso, si es capaz de levantar. ¿Ok? El señor Bitcoin, que también está en la mira. En la zona de 21.900, el mínimo de ayer, de nuevo. Otra vez de nuevo está en la zona de mínimo. Vamos a ver cómo reacciona todo. Señores, la cosa está un poquito complicada porque es que sí, oye bien, si llegase a haber también una drástica caída hoy tras las palabras de Powell, déjame decirte que entonces tendremos para el viernes también tendremos un mercado complicado. Ahí están los futuros en la vela de apertura de ayer en la noche. Muy bien, los futuros están regresando a la vela de apertura, a esa vela de apertura de ayer en la noche que fue los 3.988 y de ahí absorben rápidamente. Si te das cuenta, de ahí absorben. Ha tocado la vela de apertura en varias ocasiones y absorbe rápidamente. Eso significa de que es un buen síntoma por el momento. Cada vez que llega a esa área, absorbe rápidamente y se dispara al alza. Así que vamos a ver cómo está esa parte ahí. El dólar, por su parte, señores, el dólar, creo que ya es hora de que, papito, por favor, es hora de que, vamos a ver en 15 minutos, papito, es hora de que ya te controles después de que esa inmensa subida que tuviste ayer tocó muchísimo en el área de 105.882 y bueno, ya empezó a caer, pero está haciendo una absorción. Está haciendo una absorción aquí en esta parte, absorbiendo un poco. Vamos a ver entonces cómo en esa parte va a ir la acción. Vamos a ver cómo va a estar reaccionando aquí en esta parte. Está absorbiendo rápidamente en vela de 15 minutos, pero bueno, vamos a estar un poco tranquilos. Vamos a estar un poco tranquilos. En la diaria tiene que estar de cabeza, tiene que estar rechazando un poco más, concluyendo una onda C, al parecer, concluyendo una onda C por onda de helio en la diaria. Yo creo que esto debería regresar al 50%, más o menos como aquí, a esta parte. El retroceso debería regresar al 50% de la vela de ayer, ¿no? Vale aclarar. ¿Cómo está comportándose el VIX en la mañana de hoy? El VIX se le proyecta un movimiento de caída. El VIX no ha levantado cabeza. Se le proyecta un movimiento de caída al VIX. Movimiento de caída. Un movimiento de caída. Vamos a ver si será posible o si se logrará. Vamos a ver qué irá a hacer el VIX. Ahí, esa área. ¿Okay? El mercado está retrocediendo, está rechazando. Veamos a ver qué está haciendo Apple en vela diaria. Apple se encuentra tranquila. Nuevamente los futuros se están negociando ahí. La vela de apertura ha sido una vela decisiva. Ha ido en muchas ocasiones, ha estado yendo ahí a la vela de apertura. Vamos a ver cómo se está negociando Apple ahorita en una vela de indecisión en la diaria. Se está negociando en una vela de indecisión. En la diaria se está negociando ahí lentamente. Una vela de indecisión. Sabes que esto es un área de conflicto, pero se encuentra por encima de los 150, así que eso hay que tenerlo también. Es válido. También es válido tener en cuenta el área de 150 para nuestro querido Apple. Ahí está. Ahí está. Esta es la vela 9:30. Hace un gap. Rechaza un poco ahí. Tenemos una línea de soporte 152,30. Una línea bastante interesante donde hubo mucha negociación del precio. Está cerca de ahí, rebote y suba. O de pronto no se acerque a esa área. Ya no se acerque ahí a esa parte. Veremos entonces qué estará sucediendo, qué estará pasando. ¿No? Estará pasando ahí. En esa área de los 152 y estaremos siendo alcista. Para Amazon en la mañana de hoy, Amazon abre rechazando, buscando liquidez. Abre rechazando, está buscando liquidez por doble piso. Por doble piso está buscando ahí. Bien, pero no sabemos qué tanto se pueda sostener ahí, si más bien sea un movimiento que nos engañe. Por su parte, Google, a ver, después de una apertura siendo alcista, muy bien, empieza a rechazar. Necesitamos ya definirnos por encima de esos 95 con fuerza, si es lo que estamos buscando, o en su defecto, si el movimiento viene a caer, yo creo que esta vez ya perderá la zona de los 90 y hay que ir proyectando entonces un doble piso para Google a la zona de 85. Para el tema de Nvidia, se está sosteniendo en un área interesante, 235 es el punto medio. Pero recuerda que llegó a 240, ¿verdad? 240 y el mínimo 230, ahorita está en 235, eso quiere decir que es el punto medio. Ahí es el punto medio, que es el punto medio de Nvidia en estos momentos. Ese es el punto medio de Nvidia en estos momentos. Vamos a ver cómo sigue la negociación en 5 minutos, pues. Se mostró que llegó a un máximo de 2.36, retrocede y se mantiene ahora en 2.35. Para Microsoft, no me gusta mucho el movimiento de Microsoft, honestamente te lo digo, no me agrada, no me gusta demasiado, ya que aquí en esta área, pues, estamos perdiendo fuerza alcista, no queremos acercarnos más al área o por debajo de la zona de los 2.53, 2.52, porque eso abriría camino a la zona de 2.50. Eso abriría camino a la zona de 2.50. Oye bien, abriría camino a la zona de 2.50 y perderíamos fuerza lanzándonos al 2.45 durante las próximas sesiones, así que hay que tener cuidado con el tema de con el tema de Microsoft, que es una de las que lidera el mercado. Una de las que lidera el mercado de valores. Así que hay que tener precaución, cautela con él. Mira cómo viene rechazando, y es posible entonces que el mercado venga también rechazando. Para el tema de Meta, se alejó muy rápido de la zona del 190. Muy rápido, puede otra vez buscar la mitad, o sea, puede ir de pronto proyectándose a la zona de 185, se pare, no pueda más ahí, el movimiento rechaza de nuevo. Yo creo que hay que tener mucha cautela. Yo rechazó demasiado rápido del área de 190. Para Tesla, a ver qué está haciendo nuestro querido Tesla. Bueno, ya Tesla ha estado perdiendo mucho campo. Así que considero ahí de que hay que tener precaución. Tesla perdiendo los 180. Ahí zona de 163. Se veríamos el freno, ¿no? En esta caída. Puede ser ahí a la zona de 163. Puede irse proyectando Tesla en estos momentos. Parece que el mercado está reaccionando. Yo digo, quien está liderando ahorita hoy es nada más y nada menos que Microsoft. Es la líder que estoy viendo ahí. Lo que está haciendo que esta barra, mira, esta barra bajita de 9.40 a 9.45. Este movimiento de ese sentimiento de caída que estamos observando ahí. Creo que nos está de pronto quizás nos está haciendo que el mercado esté un poco débil. ¿verdad? Que el mercado esté ahí. Bueno, ahí está haciendo una barrita de doble piso en 5 minutos. Vamos a ver si esa barra de doble piso, ahí están otra vez los futuros. Hay mucha negociación en la vela de apertura de ayer. Ahí se está levantando un poco más. En este caso se está levantando un poco más Microsoft. Se está levantando ahí. Vamos a ver con qué fuerza se levantará o quedará Microsoft ahí. Esta parte. El resto de las compañías, por ejemplo, AMD está ahí, bien posicionada por encima de los $80. También mostrando un sentimiento alcista. Intel, a ver qué estás haciendo. También está mostrando un sentimiento alcista. Buena barrita de negociación en 5 minutos. Taiwan Semiconductores. Oye, Taiwan Semiconductores está muy elevada, muy elevada. Ojo con eso. Ojo con eso que puede venir por aquí a esta onda de Elliott por debajo de los 88, por ahí aproximadamente. Así que hay que tener mucha cautela. ¿Qué está haciendo Baba? ¿Qué está haciendo Baba? Baba inicia hoy con un gap. Mira, después que estaba en 100 y tanto, otra vez Baba regresa a la zona de 85, cercano a 86, 85. Yo creo que otra vez Baba nuevamente a una negociación bajista. Sí, yo creo que va a una negociación bajista de nuevo. Creo que va a tomar un impulso antes de perforar la zona de los $80. Baidu hace un gap bajista, se está debilitando muy rápido Baidu después que llevaba mucha fuerza alcista, se debilita muy rápido. Muy rápido se debilita Baidu. Tengamos eso muy en cuenta. JD es una apuesta a futuro que me gusta. Es una apuesta a futuro que se ve agradable. Así que podemos tener eso en cuenta más adelante cuando las aguas se calmen, si es que se calman por ahora porque hay mucha incertidumbre. Tecnología y software, pues la mayoría están ahí entremezcladas entre rojas y verdes. El sector de autos, saben que siempre es liderado por Tesla. Y el sector de autos, pues las demás compañías, vamos a ver cómo están, cómo se comportan. En este caso, Carvana está llegando a un área de mucha liquidación. Ahí se puede esperar un rebote, ojo con eso. General Motor, aquí en esta parte, wow, General Motor está hoy, señores, mira cómo va eso. Zona de entrada para nuestra querida General Motor. Señores, zona de entrada, vela verde, supera todo, señores, se está elevando más. General Motor lleva volatilidad al alza, muy bien, volatilidad al alza, posible rechazo, posible rechazo por aquí en este bloquecito, cercano a los $40. Hay que estar vigilando si ese rechazo se viene, pues estaría buscando la parte B de la onda. otra vez al 39.50. Para Rivian, nuestra querida Rivian. Hay mucha gente comprando Rivian en estos momentos. Por ahí estuve hablando con ciertas personas y eso. Hay muchísima gente comprando Rivian. Hay muchísima gente comprando Rivian, de verdad. Comprando acciones, no solamente contratos. Mucha gente comprando acciones de Rivian. Mucha gente comprando acciones de Rivian y guardándola. Esto que estás viendo aquí en pantalla, un Rivian a $14, eso es un regalo. Para mí sí es un regalo. Quizás en 16 no lo era, ni todo lo demás, pero es un regalo. Es un regalo ahí en la zona de $14 para ir comprando. 10 acciones ahorita te costarían más o menos unos $150. Cae un poco más, compro unas 5, compro unas 3, compro unas 2. Si no cae más, me quedo con las que voy acumulando. Pero me parece bien. Para mí, no es un consejo financiero para nadie. Para mí me parece bien. Y vamos a ver si voy a estar adquiriendo un poquito de acciones de ¿no? Vamos a ver qué hace Uber como compañía de tecnología, pero también liderada en el tema de autos. Se le espera un pequeño rebote. Vamos a ver si ese rebote se va, viene. En el caso de Lyft, bueno, yo creo que Lyft en 2 años le estoy apostando a $20. 2 años estoy apostándole a $20 para el año 2025. Le estoy apostando a $20. A $20 le estoy apostando para Lyft. Vamos a ver cómo viene esa negociación. Cómo viene esa negociación ahí para el tema del Lyft. ¿Okay? Para Ford también, saben que esto es una compañía muy tradicional en bolsa. Para el tema de Ford también hemos estado haciendo alcista. Nos encontramos en un punto de resistencia. Estamos en un punto de resistencia en 5 minutos. Vamos a ver si rompe ese punto de resistencia y se eleva un poco más. Para Stellantis, a ver qué está haciendo Stellantis. A ver qué está haciendo Stellantis. También créeme que es un precio bueno. Un precio bueno. Un precio, bueno, no, mentira, perdón, estaba confundiendo Stellantis con LA Autos, no. Stellantis ya está en un precio bastante elevadito porque nosotros veníamos haciéndole seguimiento a Stellantis desde los $12. Desde aquí, desde esta área por acá, de los 15, 12, $13, cuando estuvo por aquí también la veíamos, no le veíamos una proyección y mira dónde va ahorita. Mira dónde va ahorita cerrando un ciclo en la zona de 18, imagínate, hubiera comprado por acá en 11, el desplazamiento. Esto fue en diciembre, ya estamos en marzo, 3 meses. Ya usted puede estar observando cómo está la negociación de Stellantis. Ya habría que esperar que baje un poco más, por lo menos cercano a la media móvil 200, zona de los $16. Ahí podemos estar empezando a mirar qué podemos hacer por Stellantis. 2 compañías interesantes para el futuro. Y cuando hablo de futuro, hablo de muchos años. Estamos hablando de Lucid. Otra vez vuelto a unos precios interesantes. De nuevo vuelve a unos precios interesantes por debajo de su punto medio de negociación, que son los $9. Otra vez está ahí Lucid Motor, de nuevo negociándose a un precio también, aquellos que les gusta Lucid, ¿no? Esto no es algo de ellos que consideran y estudian una compañía y creen que le puede hacer parte del portafolio. Me gusta. Para el caso de NIO también, mira, ahí está NIO, por debajo de $10 también podemos estar proyectando una buena compra para el tema de NIO. Para el tema de NIO podemos estar ahí mirando adquisiciones, por lo menos está llegando al cero FIBO de nuevo, zona de $8.50 en la diaria. Ahí se pueden disparar nuevamente compras al alza, así que hay que tenerlo muy en cuenta. Para LI Autos, vamos a esperarle todavía en la diaria un retroceso más. Yo considero que un punto de entrada debemos esperar por debajo de por lo menos de los $18. Es un punto bueno de entrada para LI Autos. Es un punto de entrada bueno para LI Autos ahí en esa parte. ¿Listo? Para tenerlo en cuenta. Oye, Netflix, perdiste los 320. Netflix viene otra vez a los precios que... No, Netflix viene otra vez a un doble piso. Vamos otra vez a la zona de 270 inicialmente. Esto se está proyectando a los 270. A los 270 otra vez Netflix. Estamos en 306. ¿Sí? Vamos otra vez. Una tendencia bajista. Creo que la predicción respiramos un poquito al alza. Que puede estar experimentando una negociación fuerte por debajo de los 300. Y una presión vendedora cuando caiga por debajo de los 300. Vendiendo hasta un doble piso por ahí al área de 270. Así que hay que tener eso muy en cuenta, muy en cuenta. ¿Ok? 9:54, ya va a empezar, ¿sí? Ya va a empezar ahorita el señor Jerome Powell. Vamos a ver si estarán transmitiéndolo. Yo creo que sí, van a estar transmitiéndole, señores. Lo que sabemos es que ayer la bolsa pues estuvo bastante bajista. El SPY se mantiene tranquilo en el área de 3.98 hasta el momento. Vamos a ver en vela de 5 minutos cómo va a estar esta reacción. Vamos a ver cómo se va a comportar esta reacción. O simplemente pues, a lo que todos están esperando hoy, ¿no? Una caída. 5 minutos para las 10 de la mañana. Esto fue el mercado ayer. Vamos a actualizarlo a hoy. A ver cómo abre. Si abre de la misma manera. Abre un poquito entremezclado. La más afectada Tesla. Baba. Y vemos que están tratando de hacer un pequeño impulso alcista en 5 minutos. Mira, están haciendo un pequeño impulso alcista en 5 minutos. Nuestro índice de codicia y miedo, vamos a actualizarlo. Él siempre está ahí actualizado, pero queremos ver cómo está. Vamos a actualizarlo. A ver qué tendremos, qué podemos mirar. Sí, estamos en una zona neutral. Vamos a ver cómo se comporta entonces esta parte o esta área de aquí de nuestro índice de codicia y miedo. Dice que ver mientras el presidente de la Fed, Powell, testifica ante el Congreso, que va a ser hoy, ahorita. El CEO de JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, dice que la invasión de Ucrania es una de las principales preocupaciones económicas. Yo siempre lo he dicho, una guerra justifica todo. Este desarrollador está feliz de que la construcción de casas nuevas esté cayendo. ¿Quién será? Se necesitan más aumento de tasas, dice Mary Daly de la Fed, ya eso lo sabemos. En la semana del infierno en Wall Street, por aquí está diciendo un periodista de Bloomberg. Así que, ¿qué estará pasando? ¿Verdad? Casi todas las empresas del S&P 500 reportaron ganancias, los resultados no son geniales. Bueno, ya solo habíamos visto esa noticia anterior, pero sí, señores, este mes, yo no diría la semana, yo diría que el mes completo es un mes caliente, muy caliente, porque toda la semana tendremos reportes fuertes, porque toda la semana tendremos una cantidad de cosas bastante fuertes en los mercados. Pero nuestra gente de YouTube está en silencio hoy, regálenos un like, comenten, díganos dónde nos están viendo para tener la oportunidad de saludarlo. Por ahí nos escribe Jenny. Jenny, saludos, espero que estés bien. ¿Sí? Vamos a ver, ya dentro de unos minutos estará testificando el señor Jerome Powell. Y antes de eso, antes de empezar a testificar, la bolsa ha empezado a subir. La bolsa ha empezado a subir, los futuros también han empezado a negociarse, siendo alcistas. Los futuros se están negociando. Mira esa barra que lleva el SPY, señores, mira esa vela en 5 minutos que está llevando nuestro querido SPY. Los futuros están a punto de entrar ahí, 3.995. Creo que el dólar, señores, está de cabeza. Bueno, no tanto, todavía no tanto. Todavía no tanto está el dólar de cabeza. Los futuros están 3.000, mira esa barrita que llevan. Área de 3.995. Necesitamos pasar a la zona de 4.000. Necesitamos pasar a la zona de 4.000 para tener un poco más de confianza. Necesitamos pasar a la zona de 4.000 aquí, en los futuros. Veamos cómo han sido estas últimas horas de negociación. Vamos a ver. Durante la jornada de ayer y toda la noche y la madrugada, los futuros estuvieron siendo, ahí un poquito, déjame quitar las líneas, estuvieron siendo un poquito lateral, ahí hubo acumulación. Siempre estuvieron cerca de la zona de 3.982.25, fue el mínimo, pero sabes que bueno, la vela de apertura estuvo en 3.988 ayer a las 6 de la tarde, y en estos momentos, pues en vela de una hora, esta hora que ya está a punto de cerrar, ya en 40 segundos, ahí está mostrando lo que está sucediendo. Necesitamos pasar por encima de la zona de 4.000 y lo que estamos buscando es un mercado alcista. Para hoy, si no lográsemos superar, oye bien, ¿sí? No lográsemos superar, pues hay que pensar, honestamente hay que ponerse pues las manos en la cabeza y pensar en un mercado bajista, bajista. Pero bueno, 2 días bajistas, más los reportes de mañana, más los reportes del viernes y todo lo que se viene, es complicado. Queremos a ver qué piensa de esto Powell. 10 de la mañana, señores, vamos a esperar a ver. No, la reacción del mercado empieza así, mira. Empieza a rechazar de nuevo otra vez la misma historia de ayer a las 10. Yo no estoy operando todavía, yo estoy esperando, quietecito, manos atrás. Todavía no. El mercado perfora otra vez a la zona de inicio, perfora más 3.980. Perfora más todavía el mercado y absorbe y empieza a absorber de manera agresiva, de manera violenta, ¿no? Y empieza a absorber. Así que vamos a esperar a ver si tenemos por aquí ya en directo al señor Jerome Powell. Mira, a ver si lo tendremos. No, parece que todavía no está. No ha llegado todavía. No ha llegado. Ahí están los mercados perforando. ¿Qué está haciendo el SPY en este aspecto? En este aspecto el SPY en 15 minutos también está entrando en una zona donde hay mucha liquidación. Está liquidando. Llega al 3.97, 3.96. Aumenta a un poco más la liquidación. Aumenta todavía un poquito más la liquidación. A ver si encuentro por aquí un directo de la CNBC, pero no, parece que la CNBC no va a estar aquí. Acuérdate que Powell va a estar hoy ante el Congreso, ¿no? Ayer estuvo frente al Comité de Finanzas del Senado de los Estados Unidos, hoy va a estar frente al Congreso completamente. Vamos a ver. Ahí está la reacción, está absorbiendo. Vimos algo muy parecido, ¿no? A lo de ayer, a esta misma hora, y Powell no había empezado a hablar. Powell no había empezado a hablar todavía. Yo creo que por aquí lo tengo en Yahoo Finance. Sí, por acá lo tenemos. Sí, aquí lo tenemos, pero todavía no empieza. Por aquí lo tenemos ya. Listo y preparado para cuando el señor Mr. Powell venga. Dice Jenny, saludos a todos desde la Ciudad del Sol. Perfecto. Ahí mira, absorbió rápidamente el mercado. Pero no recupera el 3. No recupera el 398, ¿no? Absorbe, pero no recupera el 398. No recupera todavía el 398. Todavía no. Todavía no recupera el 398. Vamos a ver. Analizar algo por aquí. Ver. Caerá todo hoy, señores. Ay, Dios. ¿Será que todo caerá hoy? Yo, mientras tanto, disfrutando mi taza de café. A esperas. Ahí está nuevamente recuperando el 398. Recupera de nuevo el 398. El SPY recupera de nuevo el 398. Ahí está, recuperando el 398. Absorbió desde el área de 396.83. Una absorción rápida. Estamos en vela de 15 minutos. Vamos a vela de 5. Vamos a vela de 5. Absorbe rápidamente. Necesitamos un cambio de tendencia por encima del 399. Sería un buen síntoma. Si tratamos de buscar ese cambio de tendencia. Ahí estamos de nuevo. Vela de apertura. Los futuros acaban de absorber. Y están peleando en la vela de apertura. Los futuros están peleando en la vela de apertura. Puede absorber de otra vez del 3.974.25, un mínimo de hoy. Wow, ese es un punto interesante. 3.974.25. Este punto de aquí, yo lo activo acá. Este era un punto de mi línea. Míralo acá. Claro, llegaron ahí. Wow. O sea que sí funcionan las áreas de conflicto. Vamos a actualizar. Claro, ustedes ven ahí una cantidad de líneas en esto, pero es que son líneas muy interesantes porque voy a poner así rápidamente en pantalla. Voy a poner aquí rápidamente en pantalla para entender. Te darás cuenta que esa área, ahí disculpa la cantidad de gráficos y todo lo que tenemos, esta área aquí fue donde el mercado empezó a subir. Ok, subió, descontó y llega entonces ahí esa área, ¿verdad? Donde empezó a subir y el mercado entonces viene y llega ahorita en estos momentos a ese punto interesante donde él empezó su racha alcista. ¿Será que, óyeme bien, ahora, ya me quito todas las líneas para que se limpie un poco más el gráfico. Ahora, ¿será que estamos en el movimiento de que subimos? Oye bien, y aquí es donde está la clave para hoy. Sería que después de esta subida, que iniciamos desde aquí, desde la parte más baja, 3.925, fuimos subiendo, que estuvimos diciendo que veíamos un mercado irracional y eso era subir. Esto es vela de 1 hora de negociación. El mercado desciende, pero oye bien, no cae por debajo de este despliegue de acumulación. Podemos decir entonces de que esta área de aquí fuerte es área institucional, porque de aquí soportaron y siguieron despegando más el mercado al alza. Entonces, ¿qué podemos concluir hasta este momento? Que después de haber retrocedido, hizo un movimiento de throwback hasta ahora. De throwback, el movimiento entonces sube, rechaza, busca un soporte interesante, en este caso los 3.974.25, y sabes que ese punto lo esperaba yo era anoche que estuve quedándome viendo por ahí los futuros. Dije, ¿será que vamos allá? ¿Será que sí? ¿Será que no? Y mira entonces que lo consigue ahorita en la mañana, llega, se soporta ahí en esa parte, oye bien, se soporta aquí en esa área, rechaza rápidamente porque la absorción fue a una velocidad impresionante en 5 minutos. Entonces, si es así, óyeme bien, si llegase a ser así y se nos confirma ahorita, tendremos una jornada en futuro por encima de 4.000, estaría confirmando también en el SPY por encima de 400 y en el SPX también por encima de 4.000, estaríamos entre nuestras probabilidades, estaríamos lanzando una proyección por encima de la zona de 4.100. posiblemente estaremos lanzando ahí por encima de los 4. Por encima de los 4.000. Parece que ya empezó. Vamos a ponerle pausa a nuestra musiquita y vamos a escuchar entonces el live de esto, señor.
Also appears the Federal Reserve Board is laying the groundwork for climate policy to be implemented through the Fed regulation with an opening salvo to quote-unquote
Déjame saber si se escucha bien ahí, no se vaya a escuchar muy alto y
addressing an issue like climate change is important.
Déjeme saber si se escucha bien ahí, por favor.
Should originate here in Congress by the elected representatives of the people, not the central bank. As you said, the Fed needs to stick to its knitting. I agree. There is concern from many that the Fed is picking up new needles and knitting partisan sweaters. At such a precarious time for our economy here at home and the global economy, that would be...
Vamos a ver cómo van reaccionando los mercados. Están absorbiendo.
I look forward to your testimony and the questions by our members. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the committee, Ms. Waters, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chair Powell. Since your last visit, our country, under the leadership of President Biden, has made major progress to improve economic conditions, including adding a record 12 million jobs, reducing unemployment to its lowest rate in 54 years, while also reducing the deficit by $1.7 trillion. Unfortunately, many families are still struggling to afford basic necessities.
Bueno, empezaron a tirarle a Powell, señores.
What's more, interest rate hikes are making borrowing, especially for mortgages, outrageously expensive. Since I raised this concern for you in a November letter, the rate hikes continue to have an outsized impact on housing costs, which are, as you know, a primary driver of core inflation. But, Mr. Chair, I think that you will agree that Congress also has a role. That's why I'm somewhat disappointed that after 2 months, Republicans have taken no serious action to address inflation. By this time last Congress, House Democrats had passed the American Rescue Plan to provide relief from the ongoing pandemic, which included our committee's efforts to provide $70 billion for homeowners, renters, businesses, and first responders. If Republicans are looking for ideas, committee Democrats have put forth additional bills, like the Build Back Better Act, to bring down costs for Americans, especially housing costs. Even more concerning, we're just months away from an economic catastrophe beyond what we have ever seen, including spiking interest rates, massive job losses, and global instability. I'm talking about the threats by Republican leadership to force a default on our nation's debt if we don't agree to their demands to cut Social Security, Medicare, or other critical programs. You've urged Congress to take immediate action to raise the debt ceiling. But rather than focusing on this very real issue, the first bill
No, ¿cuál va a ser la reacción frente a esta intervención?
to the floor instead suggested that Social Security and Medicare are socialist threats to America. Since then, we have considered legislation related to deregulating securities and banking laws and countering threats from China, but Republicans have completely ignored the biggest economic threat to businesses, consumers, and our economy, defaulting on our debt. Last month, I wrote a letter to Chair McHenry
Cómo va reaccionando
take this matter seriously and hold a
las
hearing. I'm
compañías.
still waiting for a response.
Microsoft lo que hace es que se aleja más.
Today, to the real consequences
No me gusta esto.
even the mere
Microsoft
threat
se
of
aleja
would have for
tocando el 250 y rechaza
I'm so pleased that we're finally making progress.
En cambio,
on
Nvidia,
diversity and
siendo
inclusion
alcista,
for key positions at the Fed,
en 15 minutos,
including last year's historic confirmation
Tesla se aleja
of
más,
Lisa Cook to serve as the
dando
very
la zona de
first
180.
Black woman on the Federal Reserve Board, with the board's vice chair and Kansas City Fed president positions vacant. I think
Meta
President Biden
se
and
mantiene.
Kansas City Fed board should build on this progress by seriously considering
Amazon
diverse candidates for these positions. With that, I yield back
llega a
to you.
zona de mínimo. Google
The ranking member yields back the balance of my
Google
time.
toma fuerza un poquito. Vamos a ver qué pasa.
My letter to Secretary.
Todavía Powell no habla, le están leyendo
from
unos
February
documentos, una intervención.
Asking for an update on the ex-date for the debt ceiling.
Todavía Powell no
Also
habla.
asking unanimous consent to submit for the record the latest CBO long-term budget outlook on the unsustainability of our debt, most recently released. And without objection, so ordered. I'll now recognize the Chair of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Barr, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Powell, thank you for being here today to discuss the Federal Reserve's monetary policy actions in a time of economic uncertainty, mixed economic data, historic inflation that continues to plague families and businesses around the country. It is paramount that the Federal Reserve remain vigilant on reducing inflation, anchoring inflation expectations,
Lo mismo que subió,
and restoring price
bajaron.
stability at the Fed's 2% target. I also look forward to discussing the Fed's regulatory and supervisory activities. As the Fed reviews the bank capital framework, it needs to consider the impact to the real economy and our global competitiveness when raising capital requirements and sidelining capital would work at cross purposes with monetary tightening, constraining the supply side when we need more, not less, investment to fix supply chains and reduce inflation. Tailored regulations are required of the Fed by law, and a one-size-fits-all approach would be the wrong path to take. Finally, I urge the Fed, in your words, to stick to its knitting and not attempt to be a climate regulator. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize the ranking member of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee, Mr. Foster, for 1 minute.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being here today. Today is the 15th anniversary of when I was first elected to Congress and placed on the Financial Services Committee, just as the economy was about to collapse. And so that was my trial by fire, the emergency response to rescue the economy and the legislative
Todavía Powell no llega,
response
señores.
that successfully stabilized our financial system. So 15 years later, as I take my place as the ranking member on the
Todavía no
Committee
llega el hombre.
on U.S. Banking and Monetary Policy, I recall the
Y el mercado se mantiene, hizo un falso movimiento a la baja, retrocede y ahora se mantiene ahí estable. Se mantiene estable.
Lead times to manufacturers are back to pre-COVID levels. The job market retains supernatural strength, and inflation is responding more or
Mantiene
less
estable, poca volatilidad.
measures. And by far, the largest threat on the horizon is a repeat of the 2011 default crisis. Congress has the power to avoid that, and we owe it to the American people to do so. And I yield back.
Today, we welcome the testimony of Jerome Powell, Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve.
Bueno, ahí vienen, señores, le están dando la bienvenida a la entrada a Powell.
Second four-year term as chair on May 23rd, 2022. Chair Powell also serves as chairman of the Federal Open Markets Committee and the system's principal monetary policymaking, which is the system's principal monetary policymaking body. Chair Powell, we thank you for taking the time to be here. We will recognize you for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation or testimony. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Chairman Powell, you're recognized.
Chairman McHenry.
Bueno, empezó el hombre.
And other members of the committee, good morning. And I appreciate the opportunity to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation is causing significant hardship, and we're strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% goal.
Está hablando de la inflación alta,
Forceful actions to tighten
que la tarea es llevarla al 2%.
We've covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our tightening so far are yet to be felt. Even so, we have more work to do. Our policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone.
Dice que el empleo está estable, está en su máximo, creo que es así.
Sustained period of labor market conditions that benefit all. I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy.
Todavía el mercado no reacciona.
From January, unemployment, consumer spending, manufacturing production, and inflation have partly reversed the softening trends that we had seen in the data just
A ver,
Some of this reversal likely reflects the unseasonably warm weather in January in much of the country. Still, the breadth of the reversal, along with the revisions to
el mercado quieren caer, todavía no, se muestran que quizás que sí, que sí, que no, que no.
FOMC meeting. From a broader perspective, inflation has moderated somewhat since the middle of last year, but remains well above our longer-run objective of 2%. The 12-month change in total PCE prices has slowed from its peak of
Sigue hablando de la inflación, sigue hablando de los porcentajes, la fecha.
As energy prices have declined and supply chain bottlenecks have eased. Over the past 12 months, core PCE inflation, which excludes the volatile food and energy prices, was 4.7%. As supply chain bottlenecks have eased and tighter policy has restrained demand, inflation in the core goods sector has fallen. And while
Ahí dicen el dólar subiendo, vamos a ver.
High, the flattening out in rents evident in recently signed leases,
Pero no regresa al máximo todavía,
in this component of inflation,
ni abre desplazamiento alcista. Si lleva dos velas alcistas,
there is little sign of disinflation.
lleva dos velas alcistas, dos velas de 15 minutos alcistas, vamos a ver.
Which accounts for more than half of core consumer expenses.
Mientras que el SPY se mantiene en 3.98, estamos en vela de 15 minutos, ¿no?
Inflation in this sector, and there will very likely be some softening in labor market conditions. Although nominal wage gains have slowed somewhat in recent months, they remain above what is consistent with 2% inflation and current trends in productivity. Strong wage growth is good for workers, but only
Vamos a ver qué pasa.
by inflation. Turning to growth, the U.S. economy slowed significantly last year, with real GDP rising at a below-trend pace of 0.9%. Although consumer spending appears to be expanding at a solid pace this quarter, other recent indicators point to subdued growth of spending and production. The activity in the housing sector continues to weaken, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight. The unemployment rate was 3.4% in January, its lowest level since 1969. Job gains remain very strong in January, while the supply of labor has continued.
Parece que el mercado no le está gustando, no está tomando bien.
There were 1.9 job openings for each unemployed individual, close to the all-time peak recorded last March, while unemployment insurance claims have remained near historic lows. Turning to monetary policy.
Vamos a 5 minutos, un momento, a ver.
Well above our longer-run goal of 2%, and with the labor market remaining extremely tight, the FOMC has continued to tighten the stance of monetary
Estamos en un área de soporte, estamos en un área.
Interest rates by 4.5 percentage points over the past year. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. We are seeing the effects of our policy actions on demand in most sensitive sectors of the economy. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint.
Absorbe rápidamente, mira, ahí está.
In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy
de nuevo,
economic activity and inflation,
duro, mira, ahí
the
está.
committee slowed the pace of interest rate increases over its past two meetings.
La vela va con fuerza alcista.
Meeting by meeting, taking into account the totality
Vamos a ver si sigue el ritmo.
and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. Although inflation has been moderating in recent months, the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go and is likely to be bumpy. As I mentioned, the latest economic data have come in stronger than expected, which suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates is likely to be higher than previously.
Vamos a ver cómo viene esto.
If, and I stress that
Ahí está el SPY reaccionando,
the totality of the data were
el SPX
tightening is warranted,
también reaccionando un
prepared to
poco.
increase the pace of rate hikes. Restoring price stability,
A ver si se mantienen
maintain a restrictive stance of
estos movimientos en estas temporalidades. Mientras Powell está hablando, para mí son engañosos.
our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal.
Son engañosos hasta ahora.
Expectations well anchored. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. We will stay the course until the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission.
Señores, estamos ahí, 3.99 casi de nuevo.
Maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to
Listo, ya leyó el informe Powell, ahora vienen las preguntas.
I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purposes of questioning. Chairman Powell, there's been a lot of discussion over the last 24 hours about the effect of rate increases on the economy, a lot of debate about what you said yesterday in the Senate. But no one asked you this directly. We have a March meeting coming up, Open Markets Committee meeting coming up in 2 weeks. How do you think about the March meeting? What's your approach to that? What are we likely to see?
Thank you. So I won't repeat what I just said in my testimony, but if I turn to the March meeting, I guess I would say that we have some potentially important
Le
data.
preguntaron acerca del meeting que van a tener ahora en marzo.
One of them came out at exactly 10 o'clock. That would
Dice que están actualizando los datos, están analizando
sitting here at 10 o'clock.
y el mercado está
A
sonriendo.
jobs report on Friday and a CPI and PPI inflation report.
Van a tener en cuenta los datos el viernes de empleo
When we
y la
say that
inflación
we're
la próxima
looking at
semana.
the totality of the data, which is what I said, that does include these reports yet to come. They're going to be important in our assessment of the higher readings that we have very recently received and of the
El SPY hace una vela
overall
interesante.
of our progress in bringing inflation down, and we'll be carefully analyzing them. Again, we have not made any decision about the March meeting. We're not going to do that until we see the additional data. The larger point, though, is that we're not on a preset path, and that we will be guided by the incoming data and the evolving outlook.
But you've also said higher, longer. Is that still the case?
Yeah, so, as I said in my testimony, we look at the data since January and also the revisions to the November and December inflation data, and they suggest that the ultimate level of interest rates is likely to be higher than we'd expected.
What are those economic factors?
So, going back to January, as I mentioned, the softer inflation readings of November and December were revised up. We got a very strong inflation report for January. We got an extraordinarily strong employment report, very strong consumer spending, strong manufacturing data right across the board. And as I pointed out, some of that may have been affected by the very warm January weather, but nonetheless, all of it pointed in the same direction.
Okay, let's move to regulation. Chair Powell, in January, the Federal Reserve put out a policy statement noting that digital asset custody is a permissible activity if done in a safe and sound manner. However, if a bank can demonstrate to the Fed that it can conduct that activity in safe and sound manner, the capital impact of the SEC's staff accounting bulletin effectively precludes banks from offering digital asset custody service at any scale. Are you aware of this staff accounting bulletin by the Securities Exchange Commission and its impact on custodial services?
Oh, parece que se pasó un momento la transmisión. Deme un segundo. Espérame. Ya estamos de vuelta. Ya.
General accepted accounting principles in our
Yes.
capital regulation.
Okay.
Well, without objection, I'll submit to the submit for the record my letter to the bank regulators about this. So while the Fed says it can be done in a safe and sound manner, the Securities Exchange Commission has regulated it so that it cannot be done. Next question is certainly about bank capital standards. You got questions about this yesterday. Chair Barr has announced a holistic review of capital requirements. As I said in my opening statement, there are a lot of questions about this process. And previous statements by members of the Fed governors about the adequacy of current capital standards. And so while the Vice Chair for Supervision has announced that the Fed will engage in a holistic review of capital regulation, is that Fed staff? Is that done at the, at the governor's, the board level? What is the process? There are a lot of questions that people have about his statements.
Devuelve un poco el SPY, señores.
Understand why it's necessary for the Fed
Se
to
regresan un poco.
and what that process
A ver.
So, my general question is, do you still agree with your previous statements about the adequacy on a generalized basis of our financial system? Or are we to read into this that we're not adequately capitalized and there's a high level of risk in the system that we're unaware of at this point?
Thank you. So the why really just is that as a new Vice Chair for Supervision, Vice Chair Barr has launched into, he's taking a fresh look at everything, including capital. That actually is typical of the last two people to have this job. So that makes a lot of sense. In terms of the process, it's certainly conducted under Vice Chair Barr's leadership with input from the staff and discussions with governors on that committee. And I'm kept broadly apprised about what's going on. But
Se detiene por un momento la caída.
Nothing has been proposed to the board. Nothing has been formalized at this point. It's a lot of work that's going on. I think discussions are going on, meetings with industry and that kind of thing. When we get to the place where that's appropriate, the board will be carefully briefed. Ultimately, we'll vote on a proposal, and that proposal will go out for comment, and we'll solicit comment from any and all commenters, and we'll look very carefully at that. So it'll be a wide open process in the sunshine.
Thank you. I yield back. Now recognize the gentlewoman from California, the ranking member, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much.
Bueno.
Chair Powell, I agree with what you said on February 1st, that Congress must raise the debt limit because of what you described as the highly risky consequences of failing to do so.
Bueno, le está hablando seriamente
You are perhaps the most important
acerca de la deuda, el riesgo, el techo del límite de la deuda.
I find it very concerning that your recommendation to raise the debt limit in a
Así, la
timely manner is
recomendación.
being ignored by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I'm also concerned that the consequences of this brinksmanship are imminent. Fitch Ratings said this week they may seriously look at downgrading the U.S. debt based on the escalating brinksmanship they are observing, even if Congress ultimately addresses the debt limit at the last minute. This is history repeating itself. Standard & Poor's downgraded our debt back in 2011 when Republicans last controlled the House and threatened default. The Bipartisan Policy Center later found that the 2011 debt limit debate cost us $18.9
Reacciona el FPY de nuevo.
in higher borrowing costs, even though we never defaulted. To put that into perspective, that could have been leveraged to
Reacciona de nuevo el mercado al alza.
$200 billion in loans to small businesses through the state Small Business Credit Initiative, or to provide hundreds of thousands of people down payment assistance to buy their first home. So I want to emphasize that House Republicans, including most of the Republicans on this committee, had no qualms about paying our debts when Trump was in office. 3 times they addressed the debt ceiling in a timely manner without holding our country hostage. But Republicans now are ready to tear down the hard work of Americans everywhere to weather the pandemic and build back a strong recovery. Chair Powell, can you describe for us the risk you see if Congress continues to delay action on the debt limit, both for our economy?
Bueno,
and
hasta ahora nos mantenemos por encima del 3.98. Mientras están entrevistando a Powell.
Seek no role in what is really at the heart of fiscal policy, except I will limit myself to the 2 things that other Fed chairs have said about this. One is just that Congress raising the debt ceiling is really the only alternative. There are no rabbits in hats to be pulled out on this. 2 really is just that no one should assume that the Fed can protect the economy from the non-payment of the government's bills, let alone a debt default or something of that nature, which we don't think will happen here, but no one should be thinking that we have the tools to protect the economy from all the potential effects of that.
Thank you very much. I don't want to miss what you said. I somewhat quoted you when you said that Congress must.
Vamos a tocar el techo otra vez de 3.99.33.
As a highly risky consequence of failing to do so. Is that your language?
Well, must in the sense that it's really the only way for the debt.
Vamos a ver si un impulso llega a los 400. Vamos a ver.
Again, these are fiscal discussions.
Ha decidido, señores.
Want to be a part of them, and really they're between elected
Ha
officials.
decidido, al parecer.
On the subject.
Well, I spent a lot of time on this, as you'll recall.
As an expert
Prior
on
years.
this subject, you are concerned about the high risky consequence of failing to do so.
399.60.
Did I correctly quote you?
That's correct.
Thank you. And so, again, let me just go a little bit further.
Creo que en
The
15
chair
minutos esto se ve
mentioned
mejor.
you
A
had
ver.
either written a letter or maybe even had some conversation from Janet
15
Yellen
minutos estamos
about
buscando un área interesante.
the time limits that she had attempted to describe. Is it your understanding that she said she
Estamos a
could
punto,
maneuver
señor. Estamos a
and
punto de
kind of
llegar a esa
manipulate
onda
things
C.
so that she paid the
La onda C
bills
está
that
en
were coming
400
due,
días.
but this could only last until about June?
Vamos a ver.
Is that your
Estamos en
understanding?
399.
Honestly, I would really have to not try to interpret the Secretary's words for you. That's really up to her to do.
Can she keep us afloat until about June?
I don't, honestly, that's not for me to say. These are really
Vamos a los
questions
futuros
for
en
the Secretary. I'm
15.
sorry, Ms. Waters.
Have you had any conversation with her?
El futuro en 15 ya está
about
en
the statement that she
4.000.
made about being
Eso es un
able,
buen síntoma. Hasta
to
ahorita
manipulate
necesitamos
things
superar los
so that they could
4.000
pay bills that were coming
para que el
due out of
movimiento de
another account or
confianza.
whatever. Did you have that conversation with her?
The conversations that you and I have privately don't go anywhere. I don't talk about them with anybody, and the conversations I have with Secretary Yellen.
Para que el movimiento de confianza, el dólar, a ver,
Expired.
el dólar, wow, se está girando a la baja en 15 minutos.
You sure did. He went over time.
Está girando a la baja en
Thank
15
you.
minutos.
I yield back.
I now recognize the
A ver
Vice
si pierde
Chair
los
of the
105, 250.
of Arkansas.
Vamos a ver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being with us. You're welcome anytime.
Sigue haciendo el
Feel free to
SPY.
ask if you want to volunteer and
Todavía no
come. We
tocamos
love
los
having your views
400.
on many
Todavía no,
topics.
señores.
Thanks for
Todavía
talking
no.
about your commitment to price stability. You know, we've had this discussion last June between us of, I do think that's the primary mission of the Fed, and I think it should be the only priority of the Fed is price stability, because it's the legislative branch and the executive branch that really are responsible for, quote, full employment
SPY de
and
nuevo.
policy environment and making sure that that's right. So your commitment to price stability is welcomed by this committee. Yesterday in the Senate, you suggested that you supported a regulatory framework, a broadly regulatory framework for digital assets. Is that right?
Yes.
And is it your view that if we had a regulatory framework here in the United States for digital assets, that there'd be more transparency and rules of the road for both consumers, investors, and developers?
Absolutely.
And would it, if we had those rules of the road for business seeking to use and develop blockchain as a potential new technology in their business and tokenized payments, that again, that would be beneficial to business to know how to go
Se
about
metieron con
it.
las cripto.
Yes, and to assure that it's all done in a safe and sound manner when we're talking about banks.
Right.
Le preguntaron que
Again,
si
as
considera
I-
que es una buena
my next
tecnología la
point would be
blockchain.
exactly that.
Vamos a ver.
Banks, investment brokers, custodians understand how they could even participate in that market in a safe and sound manner. You agree that a regulatory framework would help on that?
Yes.
And then finally, we've grown up in our country, and it's unique in the world, that we have a dual banking system. And due to a quirk here in Congress over 100 years ago, we have insurance is regulated exclusively by the states. So would you believe that that regulatory framework would also have to preserve some sort of role subject to safety and soundness, you know, for states to play some role in that regulatory framework for digital assets?
Let me just say, I think that it certainly works in banking and insurance. I have no problem with those.
Right.
I'd have
But
to think
do
about
you think it could, you consider it possible that it could also work in digital assets?
certainly possible.
Yeah. Thank you. Turning to a topic that's been a subject here for nearly 4 years, central bank digital currencies. Article 1 of the Constitution reserves coins and coin issuance, money issuance to the Congress, and we've in turn delegated that to the U.S. Treasury, which has, since 1912, engaged the Federal Reserve as their fiscal agent. You've testified here many times before that
to issue a central bank digital currency, that would have to be authorized by statute by Congress. Is that still your?
Ha tenido un poquito la volatilidad, pero estamos en un área buena. Para mí estamos en un área buena.
Potential forms of a wholesale CBDC that we need to look at.
Uy, espérate.
We've always been talking about retail CBDC, and that's something we would certainly need congressional approval for.
And what would be a parameter on something that's not a retail CBDC where you think that could be issued in some form or fashion without Congress's direct statutory authorization?
It would be, for example, it would just be something between banks, so it would look an awful lot like a bank reserve. And you might ask, well, why would we need it? And that's a really good question too.
Yeah.
But just something that's literally within a wholesale market.
But that speaks that you might have a blockchain between banks and the Fed using a central bank digital currency token to settle transactions institutionally inside yeah.
Yes.
So that leads me to
Ay.
now.
Están hablando de algo bastante interesante,
Up and running, I think,
dándole la confianza a la CBDC, al próximo dólar digital.
I would like to ask you to formally have this full committee briefed on that by the Federal Reserve. I know the chair of the Kansas City Bank was involved. She's now left. And I think the committee has a lot of questions about FedNow, how its interoperability will work, how it's going to roll out. And also just a question that we've been asked, that why the Fed wire system isn't up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week now to benefit consumers that are using Venmo. Do you have a thought on that?
I'm not sure why we're not 24/7 on that, and of course, we'd be delighted to come up and brief the committee on FedNow.
That'd be good. We'll take you up on that and the right person from the Fed. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now
Un
recognize
poco de volatilidad a la baja.
the ranking member of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Mr. Sherman of California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for bringing to our committee's attention several years ago the importance of tough legacy LIBOR, some $16 trillion of instruments where the creditor wouldn't know how much the debtor was supposed to pay.
No, ¿cómo va esto?
This committee, we passed legislation over a year before the LIBOR hit the fan. You issued regulations 7 months before the absolute deadline. I hope we do this in other areas, and it's my understanding that with those final regulations, we're done, and we've solved the LIBOR issue. Is that correct?
That's my understanding as well.
Good. People talk about inflation, and they somehow say that it's a matter of the personalities and politics in the United States. Others argue that the entire world is hit by inflation because Ukraine and COVID. I think we've got the answer to this question in that inflation is considerably higher in the Eurozone than it is in the United States today. And it's very hard to say that Joe Biden is responsible for inflation in Germany. I commend the ranking member for bringing up the debt limit.
Le tiraron duro ahí.
That's already done to our economy. If we solve the problem tomorrow, we had less investment than we would have had yesterday. And I would say that I commend the president. He's going to issue a budget plan tomorrow. And perhaps in their time, one of our Republican colleagues can tell us when the Republican budget plan will be released. We are all eagerly awaiting it. Housing is a huge part of inflation, and we've left it to local government, but the permitting process there guarantees scarcity, which guarantees high housing costs. Mr. Chair, we've talked back in 2001 and several times even before that about wire fraud. And having just bought a home, I saw the process up front. Everybody's very nervous about one thing, and that is, will the buyer of the house be tricked into wiring their down payment to the wrong account? Or will the seller, the buyer or the escrow agent be tricked into sending the money to someone other than the seller of the property?
Volver a subir en 5.
Back in 2001, where I urged you with your FedNow
Para que
system,
el
which
FPY en 5 minutos se aguanta
to have what the Brits
todavía.
when you send
aguanta
your
un poco
wire, you
más.
identify not only the number of the account you're sending it to, but also
Estaremos
the
frente a
name
una
of the
fuga
person or entity that's
al
supposed to
alza.
receive that.
Vamos a ver.
At
Vamos a
that
ver.
time, back in 2001, you said that payee matching is not the best way to do it. There are other ways to do it, and that you'd be happy to get back to me as to how you're going to make sure that an email from a Nigerian prince does not get the wired funds, particularly in a housing transaction, wired to an account number that turns out to be in Lagos. What progress do you have?
Estamos retrocediendo, no absorbemos.
Have a system where they're sending it to a named payee as well as to a number.
So I hope we did come back in a timely way to you on that. But it's a problem you've brought to our attention, you're right, over many years. And we continue to focus on that.
Well, the bureaucrats who are working on this don't want to do what the Brits did. They've proven it can be done. You said you were going to accomplish the same goal in some other way, and it has been a while, and it's not solved, nor are you aware of any solution. I would hope that you would go back and say, we don't want to add this anxiety to every real estate transaction. We go back to the drawing boards, follow what the Brits have done, and have payee matching. Finally, as to crypto, cryptocurrency says what it means. Hidden money. That's what it means. And if we impose know your customer and anti-money laundering statutes to it, it won't be crypto anymore. What crypto wants is to have part of its ecosystem above the waterline, visible and subject to know your customer, and then have the rest of the iceberg below the waterline.
Gentleman's time's expired. I will now go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman McHenry, thank you very much. Chairman Powell, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate not only your professionalism, but your direction at us. Chairman Powell, I know that the Fed considers divergences, and you talked about it as you spoke in your opening statement about consumer price index, personal consumer expenditures.
Los mercados siguen tranquilos hasta ahora.
And all these things are talked about in your report, monetary report, March 3, 2023. Thank you. A couple days ago, I had an opportunity to see that an economist, Arthur Laffer, produced a report that spoke about literally this country doubling GDP. Now, I know we're putting CPI, PCE, inflation, all these things into a mix. But he said that if we made changes in health care to efficiencies, we could double the current GDP rate. My question to you that I hope you can answer is, what do you think about that? Is that something that is in this document that I have missed? And it's seemingly to a person who follows this, as Art Laffer does for 50 years, what do you think is an important way to look at efficiencies in healthcare? Thank you.
So no, that's not in our monetary policy report. I'll just say one thing, and that is we do spend something like 17 or 18 in that range % of GDP delivering healthcare. Other similarly wealthy countries spend 10%. So it's the delivery system. It's not that the benefits are incredibly rich or anything like that.
Está regresando un poco al mercado.
That's $1 trillion a year that we spend and get nothing for it. This is fiscal policy, but I'm responding to your. So I would think that he may have meant that if we had a delivery system that saved that $1 trillion that doesn't really get us anything, then that would be great for the economy, which I would agree with.
So you've spoken of supply chain disruptions because it in fact is an inhibitor or an accelerator as we gain that advantage. You just talked about some seemingly which would offer some validation to Mr. Laffer as he spoke about the huge importance of this, is that something you should start paying attention to where policy people, not only at the Fed, but your Fed banks around the country would start looking at and start putting pressure on us to gain those efficiencies as a result of a global view?
So on supply chains generally, they have suddenly been tremendously important in inflation, as you know, for the last couple of years, and for the first time really have been something that we've had to study carefully. In terms of healthcare delivery, that is strictly a question for you and for the parts of the government that are charged with it. The Fed does not have a role to play and does not seek a role in that.
Does not see a role. And yet, as I look at this, you've got a role in projecting confidence. You've got a role in education. You've got a role in who's in the workplace. You've got a role. Interest rates, and yet my point is, it's such a staggering number that impacts us. Just love to have you go back, perhaps.
Por el mercado con rapidez, señores, un poco
Give us
más.
some direction on that, but I think your testimony today, it recognizes the staggering impact.
Pero se detiene en el 398.
Political. The answer may be political, but I think the actual numbers are not political. It's an inefficiency that is happening across the country.
En los futuros otra vez peleando con su vela de apertura.
I wanted to get your take on that.
3.988 y ahí
Thank you for
absorben.
your confidence and your hard work that you give this country. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now recognize the ranking member of the Agriculture Committee, Mr. Scott of Georgia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and welcome back, Chairman Powell. Now, Chairman Powell, listen to me very carefully here, because I think we're on the verge of making a terrible mistake. Back in 2008, if you recall, Barney Frank then and Ms. Waters asked me to take a look and kind of work with you and the Fed. You were a board member in 2008. And we came to the conclusion that we needed a more equitable playing field between our large banks, like Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and our regional and smaller banks like Truist and
Veamos cómo reacciona el índice de codicia y miedo, baja.
and we changed that.
Veamos cómo está,
But
o sea,
now
cómo
I
se
hear
comporta.
that the Fed
Mi
and the
conductor es un poquito
FTC
alcista.
plan to drop a new rule which seeks to apply the long-term and higher capital requirements that were created, and you and I did this back in 2008, and you remember, that were created for the Goldman Sachs and for them. And now we want to apply these rules to the regional banks. There's a big difference, and we've omitted this difference if you proceed in this manner. I think it's very misguided. It works, and you and I worked on this. You recall this. You were a board member, and we saw that we needed to have a better playing field to protect. And if you all go along with this, it could put many of our regional banks and small community banks out of business. So I want you to reverse this. First of all, tell me, am I speaking the truth? Are you all planning to all of a sudden here put these smaller and regional banks under the same heavy
Si el movimiento se frena aquí,
as your large world?
398.
Tell me.
No, we're not planning that. We
Well-
believe strongly and always have in tailoring to address the different size and risk characteristics of financial institutions, and certainly nothing like that for the regionals. They won't have anything like what the very large, most systemically important banks have in terms of overall regulation.
Yeah, because I remember clearly, you and I were back, I think we were on this side then.
¿Cómo continúa el dólar? A ver.
In this same committee room. And you worked
A
with
ver
us
si llega
on
aquí
that.
para
I'm glad to
rechazar.
hear that. Where is that coming from? I mean, it's a concern. It's just a rumor.
Bits.
Have there been any discussions about
Ya subió para rechazar.
the playing field and the
Dólar ahí está queriendo rechazar.
differentiations in the requirements between the regional banks, community banks, and your larger global banks?
So,
There's nothing to that?
well, I would say this. We're required by the law now, and we're doing this. Dodd-Frank actually required us.
Yes,
suggested that we should tailor, and then the S-2155 then required it. And anything that we do will reflect appropriate tailoring.
All right, so that's off the board. We're not going to change and put the smaller and regional banks under the same financial obligation role as the large banks. We got that right from you, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, good. Now let me turn to China. I'm really worried about China, and
Dólar queriendo bajar.
people may not know it, but
Igual.
China is the world's largest economy.
Queriendo bajar también. Se aguanta ahí en 5 minutos.
At our last meeting, I talked about this move where we didn't blow the balloon up. And this is an example of what I was pointing out.
Gentleman's time's expired. We'll now recognize the Chair of the Science Committee, Mr. Lucas of Oklahoma, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, I'd like to follow up on the topic of capital standards. One of those things we've discussed many times together. As you know, commodity markets have seen significant volatility in the last few years. And during times of tremendous economic uncertainty, like we've seen, end users turn to the markets to hedge risk, particularly those in the agriculture and energy sectors. And I know that the Fed is early in the review process of potential changes in capital requirements. Can you, well, I'll ask anyway. Can you commit to ensuring that these changes will not increase the cost for banks providing those commodity derivatives to end users?
That's a really specific. Can I go look at that? I mean, I'm not actually sure.
No,
the work even addresses that. So,
fair point.
To come back to you on that.
And that particular response makes me feel better, because after all, those products are very important to my folks and make a great deal of difference in how they're able to address their issues. So, as you discussed earlier, and as you've consistently assured, the Fed's not a climate-making policymaker. You and I've talked about
Igual débil en estos 5 minutos en una zona
However, I'm concerned that the Fed
interesante, se está devolviendo.
for climate-related stress tests that would reduce access to capital for entire sectors of the economy. This would also open up the Federal Reserve potentially to political pressure and force the Fed, in fact, to make policy decisions related to climate change. We've seen, for example, this administration turn to regulators.
Algo aquí interesante, mientras entrevistan al señor Powell,
Chairman Powell, how careful
están los futuros de nuevo en una zona de conflicto, se han convertido a ver la apertura en una zona de conflicto, señores.
Ensure that the Fed's regulatory toolkit is not, shall we say, warped into creating climate policy outcomes.
So, I think we do have a narrow but real role there, which is around bank supervision.
1988.
Their risks over time from climate. I think my colleagues and I all understand that.
Estamos esperando que termine la intervención de Powell.
That we're playing, and that we're not looking to, move into an area where we're actually becoming a climate policymaker.
398, sigue aguantado el mercado ahí.
That border needs to be very carefully guarded. And I will tell you that I will do that as long as I'm at the Board of Governors.
I very much
Sigue
appreciate
aguantado
that.
ahí en el
It's a
398.
very important issue to the 3rd District of Oklahoma. Traditional production agriculture, oil and gas, and the actions that the Fed takes have a significant impact back home. So it's vital that we resist the demands to do that sort of thing now or in the future. And I very much appreciate that response. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member of the Digital Asset Subcommittee, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for your willingness to come here and to update us. Last week, the Treasury Department announced that leaders from Treasury would begin to meet regularly with leaders from the Fed and from the White House to discuss a possible CBDC, central bank digital currency.
Nuevamente tocan el tema de la cripto de nuevo.
In the statement, it was mentioned, and I'll quote from it, it said that the Fed is encouraged to provide periodic public updates as it continues its research and its technical experimentation on central bank digital currencies. I was wondering, first of all,
¿Qué está haciendo Bitcoin? Se mantiene Bitcoin tranquilo, ¿no?
Some of these public updates. What's the timing on that?
So we did
Son a 22,000.
for comment in general on a CBDC a year or so ago, and I do expect we'll go out. I can't give you a date, but we'll certainly go out and engage. We engage with the public on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
We're also doing research on policy and also on technology. That's what we're up to.
I'm aware of the Boston Fed has a partnership there. The Hamilton project over there.
Reacciona todavía y el espiguay un poco.
They're doing a great job, but it says here that the discussions would include technical experimentation. I was just wondering at what level are you talking about making decisions on architecture for a CBDC, a retail CBDC?
We're not at
Hablando del dólar digital.
decisions. What we're doing is experimenting in kind of early stage experimentation. How would this work? Does it work? What's the best technology? What's the most efficient? We're really at an early stage but we're making progress on sort of technological issues. The policy issues are equally important.
Creo que el verdadero movimiento se va a ver después que Powell termine.
Right. Well, I think
Creo que el verdadero movimiento en el mercado se verá cuando Powell termine de hablar.
More dialogue with the Fed on.
Considero que va a venir el verdadero movimiento va a ser ahí.
As well, and just make sure that Congress and this committee is as up to date as others. Let me switch over to Fed now. There are some champions of digital currency and stable coins in particular that continue to cite the need for faster payment systems. However, as was earlier mentioned, the Fed now is a service that the Fed is working on to finalize that will allow for instant payments between bank accounts. And the Fed has a target release date for Fed Now between May and July, which is right around the corner. Do you see any reason why cryptocurrencies would provide faster payments than the Fed Now system? And would this offer, with the transparency of Fed Now, would it offer distinct advantages over some of these stable coins that are touting faster payments?
What Fed Now will do is it will enable all the banks, any bank in the United States, not just the big ones, to offer instantly available funds and real-time payments to their customers. That's what it will do. So that's a great thing. A CBDC, I think you're asking whether a CBDC would serve some of that, but a CBDC is going to be years in the evaluation. And, I think we can get this into the hands of the public very quickly. And I think we'll have real-time payments in this country very, very soon. And so that's a good thing.
It is. I do have an overriding question, and that is, before the greenback, everybody had their own currency. You had rail companies, you had coal companies, you had, state banks that were authorized to issue their own currency. But when the greenback came out,
Se mantiene ahí encima del 398, nuestro SPY.
Currencies went to zero because everyone had, because the greenback had the full faith and credit of the United States behind it. I'm worried about a lot of these stable coins and other cryptocurrencies. Do they go to zero when when we come up with a CBDC that has the full faith and credit of the United States behind it. And we've got thousands of these out there, and you've got people investing millions and millions of dollars in these, well, trillions right now. And I'm just thinking, if we had those advantages built into a CDBC,
Revisar algo por acá.
wouldn't those alternatives go to zero if they did not have the transparency
Quiere consolidar movimiento.
that we enjoy?
So certainly unbacked cryptocurrencies.
Haríamos el throwback perfecto desde aquí, desde esta onda.
Trade for a positive
Desde
number.
los 396.83, throwback, soporte para irnos. Área objetivo inicial, 400, 401, 402.
They're dollar denominated mainly, and they have dollar-based reserves, although we don't know what's in the reserves because there's no regulation.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, is recognized.
No, está consolidándose mucho en el 398.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Fowle, for being here this morning. The reserve currency status of the dollar to the U.S. has enormous financial and national security benefits. In the wake of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, the Fed took action to prevent the Kremlin from accessing more than $300 billion in reserves, roughly half of Russia's reserves. However, this led to an accelerated effort by countries like China to de-dollarize their official foreign exchange reserves. Just last week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal titled Russia
El dólar se sigue manteniendo en la misma alineamiento. No quiere bajar los futuros. 5 minutos se proyectan por encima de 4.000. Próxima onda 4.015 o la máxima 4.034. Pero se están consolidando ahí, en esta área. En vela de 5 minutos.
So the U.S. dollar is the widely accepted and really the only serious candidate for the world's principal reserve currency, and that's because of our democratic institutions, our liquid markets, the rule of law, and all those kinds of things, and also the fact that the dollar has held its value over time. So other countries who are competing on other playing fields may want to establish different currencies, but really the dollar is the one that's going to be used more broadly in international commerce because we have those.
Ahí están subiendo los futuros, el SPY parece que también va. Busca el 3.99 de nuevo.
These countries, because if they see themselves being challenged or concerned, for instance, if China would invade Taiwan, as Russia invaded Ukraine, there were some sanctions put on, and I don't disagree with the sanctions. The last time you were here, though, Mr. Chairman, I asked the question, because it's an instructive moment for us from the standpoint that knowing that we put sanctions on Russia, all other different accounts, as well as the oligarchs from that country, are we thinking about doing the same thing to China when they invade Taiwan? And your answer at that point was no. We passed a bill out of this committee last week to ask the administration, basically, to start thinking about that in those terms. What kind of situations can you come up with? Are you talking to allies, begin to talk to them, to start putting together a list of how you would go about sanctioning accounts, things like that? So have you started thinking about that at all yet?
Well, let me say, the business of sanctions is entirely
del 3.99.
We are an implementer as it relates to banks. That's it.
Yeah, but we're going to take your advice on different aspects of this, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry?
We're going to take your advice on the different aspects of this.
Well, I mean, honestly, when the sanctions were being put in place, Treasury was doing it. We weren't doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way it works.
Next question.
Ahí estamos ahí. A veces saltamos al 3.99 y nos lleve, esta vez sí al 400.
And it talked about the problem that we have here with the Fed's balance sheet. It says it now appears similar to a hedge fund
3.99.
financed by short-term borrowing. And the bottom line is that it's going to cost money. The Fed now has a negative income as a result of
Ahí nos vamos.
to do this.
El barco se va.
So it says here that the Fed will simply borrow the money to pay the bills. Is this true? That the Fed's losing money right now as a result of the way you've got these debt, the borrowings that you've purchased structured?
The place I would start is that the Fed has, we always turn over all of our earnings in every year. We turn them over on an ongoing basis, and we've turned over something like $1.2 trillion in earnings just in the last, decade or
Ahí
so.
estamos subiendo.
We always know that when we raise interest rates,
Okay.
you're going to lose money. And
Okay,
of course,
but
we
you
have the
agree
ability
you agree with the point that we have a negative income right now.
That's
And
right.
this makes my point to my next question, or my concern is, the CFPB gets their money. The CFPB gets their money to run their agency from the Fed.
That's right.
So basically, there's no money for the Fed to pay the CFPB's bills if this is the case, unless you continue to borrow.
El mercado está más tranquilo hoy
which
que
is
ayer.
Basically, what's going to happen now.
Yo creo que la verdadera reacción viene cuando termine la intervención de Powell.
No, we don't borrow money. We issue, basically, yes, we don't shut down the Fed when we have negative income.
Okay.
We can pay our bills and we can pay.
So my
the
question,
CFPB.
my follow-up question then is, do you do any accountability or assessing of the CFPB's spending of these dollars at all?
No, we don't.
So they just get a
Inspector
blank
General
check.
does.
You just told me they just got a blank check. They send you a bill, you send them a check. There's no accountability for them.
I think there are limits built into the law, which I don't have in the front of my head.
I have yet to see a limit, Mr. Chairman. I'd love to see what the limits are, because I don't think that they've ever agreed that they have that. But I see my time is up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to Mr. Foster, the ranking member of the Financial Institutions Monetary Policy Subcommittee.
Thank you. And just a quick comment. I think it's a mistake to imagine.
Ha habido poca volatilidad, señores. Ha habido poca volatilidad. Déjame ver si Microsoft se recuperó. Si quiere abrir desplazamiento alcista, vamos a ver. En 15 minutos, ¿cómo va?
So just a comment. I hope you have a certain fraction of futurists.
15 minutos va mejor.
Talking about your scenario planning.
Más si superamos la media móvil 20 en 15 minutos.
Okay, back to economics. So we have this
Y empezamos a hacer
low
alcistas.
unemployment rate, 3.4%. And historically, this would be considered to drive runaway inflation. Your predecessor, Alan Greenspan, repeatedly referred to dangerously low levels of unemployment. And yet we see inflation is coming down. So what is going on here? How can we have these historically low levels of unemployment without having inflation?
Seguro quieren abrir desplazamiento alcista en 15 minutos. Vamos a revisar.
Frictional unemployment in our system due perhaps to the fact that people get their new jobs online
Revisar rápidamente.
before they quit.
So inflation is coming down, but it's very high, is the thing. And some part, I've never said all of it or most of it, but some part of the high inflation
No ha dicho nada que no sepamos.
experiencing is very likely related to an extremely tight labor market. Wages
A ver si
and prices.
superamos este bloque de aquí, la zona del 4000. Es que ese bloque es el que necesitamos superar en
There was a
15.
time when there was a tight relationship between inflation and unemployment. In other words, the Phillips curve was steep, and that went away over the period of the Great Moderation. And really, in our thinking, that's because people came to expect 2% inflation.
Hemos hecho muchas mechas de
2%
rechazo.
inflation, and then people just stopped focusing on inflation, and it stayed very low.
Necesita tener una fuerza aquí en 15 minutos para llegar otra vez a los 4000.
Very weak economic growth or
A
very
ver
strong
nuestras
economic
líneas.
and we
Ahí
wouldn't
está
have
la línea de 4000, a ver si es
inflation
superada.
very much. That was before the pandemic, though.
Estamos que supere los 4000 y en el SPY que se mantenga ahí en 399, pero que esté más bien buscando en 15 minutos, que esté más bien buscando la zona ya del 400. Si te has dado cuenta, esto es un movimiento lateral. Esto ha estado lateralizando ahí, quién sabe por cuánto tiempo. Desde ayer a la 1:45, esto ha sido un movimiento lateral, con mechas de escape falsas, pero esto ha sido lateral todavía. Todavía el verdadero movimiento no lo hemos visto. No hemos visto el verdadero movimiento todavía.
About the difference between using current rental payments versus
Se está devolviendo.
for a new rental contract, and difference in how much they lag. Had you paid more attention, for example, to the leading indicators like current rental contracts, then you probably would have picked up inflation earlier. You would have been, not gotten so far behind the curve on that. And secondly, there are policy implications going forward. If you look at current rental prices for new contracts, we're much farther along in fixing inflation, and that you can take your foot off the brake. And so what's your thinking on that, and whether you may perhaps be systematically not paying enough attention to leading indicators versus lagging ones?
We've
Están
been
preguntándole a
on
Powell.
the whole housing inflation thing from the very beginning, and
Se siguen enfrascando en la inflación de nuevo.
every forecaster is baking in lower rent increases. That's a big part of why people think inflation.
Esto es PY en 15 minutos. Necesita superar ese bloque.
The thing with transitory was more
Necesitamos superar este bloquecito con ganas, con fuerza, con optimismo, si queremos ser alcista, porque hasta ahora el verdadero movimiento no lo hemos visto sobre el SPY.
In hindsight, it just took much longer for those disturbances to go away.
Yeah, so with hindsight, and if you allow yourself to Monday morning quarterback yourself, you probably would have gone up to 4% earlier and not had such a big problem with inflation. And so what is your, are there structural things you can contemplate or even after action reviews to say what would have happened if we would have paid more attention to the leading indicators or improve the in engineering term, improve the bandwidth of your feedback regulator? That this is something, if you want to get the best result, you need a high bandwidth feedback in the system, even when there's averaging on the back end.
A ver, 5 minutos que está pasando, señores.
Waking and sleeping hours, as you can imagine. It's really hard to know what the lessons
El precio pelea en 5 minutos.
We really thought
necesitamos una vela de escape.
Nobody had seen the supply chains collapse.
Va a ser al alza, que sea una vela de escape. Como esta de aquí, de las 10:30 de la mañana.
If we ever see this pitch again, we'll know how to swing at it. But it's been
we'll now recognize the
bunch of firsts. Sorry.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman, his time has expired.
Como encima de la media móvil 200 exponencial en 5 minutos. Ahí está la 20.
Thank you, Chairman McHenry and Chair Powell. Welcome. Thank you for your service and for being here today. Yesterday, I was pleased to hear you discuss
A ver si estamos ante el throwback perfecto.
is severely hurting the working
De nuevo
people in
alcista.
America. In your testimony, you also state that strong wage growth is good for workers, but only if it is not eroded by inflation. And that is key. Inflation is a tax, a hidden tax on every American. If the Federal Reserve were to
Una vela de
shorten
escape.
its mandates to stabilize prices, leaving inflation alarmingly high, what would it cost America's hard-working families in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District and beyond?
So I think the costs of failure to restore price stability would be extremely high. And while there will be costs to success, the costs of failure will be much higher. You'd be looking at an extended period where people learn to expect and live with high and volatile inflation, and it's very, very hard to have rising real incomes during such a period. So it'd be a bad thing for the country.
Can you reassure the committee that the Fed remains committed to bringing prices down for our constituents?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
I hereby assure you.
Se devuelve la que creíamos que era la vela de escape, señores. Todavía los movimientos no se han dado.
And about 18% of the world's population resumes its consumption of oil and other key goods. What sort of inflationary impact will we see here in the United States, sir?
So a faster reopening of China.
Vamos a ver.
It looks like we may be seeing. It does have the potential to put upward pressure on commodity prices, but it also
El dólar que estás haciendo en 5 minutos.
Unraveling of the problems in
El
supply
dólar
chain.
cayó, respira. Vamos a ver si esta vela se posiciona por debajo aquí de los 105,480.
For the United States, it might be bigger for
Estaría haciendo que el mercado se devuelva un poco o darle un voto más de confianza, pero no que absorba al alza.
Importers. And do you expect any inflationary effects on global energy markets as China's oil consumption returns to their previous levels?
So I think oil prices could be affected, and I think that's a big concern in Europe, for example. We have our own domestic oil, and we've got a lot of natural gas as well.
We sure do. I wish we were actually
No, porque
harvesting
no,
more
en
of that
5 se está
natural
devolviendo el
gas.
SPY, señores.
Chair Powell, you, Vice Chair Barr, and many others have recently identified that the banking
Los futuros también se
system is
devuelven,
well-capitalized and strong.
pero siguen respetando un área interesante, el
Bank capitalization remains robust
3992,
amid
y
the
ahí
shock of the
rechazan y
pandemic
nuevamente
and
absorben.
related shutdowns of economic activity. Capitalization of large financial institutions weathered
Vamos a ver cómo va a estar
severe
esto.
stress testing mandated by the Fed. And despite all of that, as also previously mentioned by Chairman McHenry, Vice Chair Barr insists on conducting a review of capital rules. I'm concerned that this review is being conducted in a silo, and that the findings will not be made fully available to the public. Taking such an approach in the context of this holistic capital requirement review would make it impossible to conduct a transparent rulemaking process, denying the public information necessary to consider and to comment. I think this is just simply not appropriate in this situation, and I'm concerned.
Ahí se trata de devolver.
Of clarity, I think is the best word, perhaps at this
Ha
point.
habido mucho rechazo. Las velas absorben.
Served on the Fed board for over 10 years since
Y se da.
the financial crisis. Regulatory
Vamos a ir buscando lentamente, en cualquier momento, un escape ahí, a la zona por encima de los 400, creo. Seguimos estando cerca de un soporte interesante, 398, donde el mercado se ha estado moviendo y moviendo durante horas ahí. Pero queremos ver entonces, realmente estaremos ahí frente a un movimiento favorable, ¿no?
I hope so. I'm glad to hear you say in a highly transparent manner. Do you agree that excessively high capital levels constrain banks' lending capacity with spillover effects on jobs and living standards for Americans?
So I think it's always a balance, right? More capital means more safety and soundness and more ability to withstand terribly stressful periods. But it also
Está encima de la media móvil 20, siguen entrevistando a Powell.
U.S. banks have competed incredibly well around the world.
Yes,
with
they have,
high levels
internationally.
of capital. But so that's a trade-off that you're always going to be making when you think about capital.
Gentlewoman's
My
time
time
has
is
expired.
Yes, thank you.
We'll now recognize the gentlewoman from Ohio, the the ranking member of the National Security Subcommittee, Ms. Beatty. Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I like that title. To Chairman Powell, thank you for coming and being such a good colleague and friend. I have a couple questions I'm going to try to get through quickly. Chair Powell, in a press conference last month, you stated, quote, "There is a lot of spending coming into the construction pipeline, both private and public, and so that's going to support economic activity."
Señores, nos engaña con el movimiento alcista y se devuelve.
Pipeline of funding from what the Democrats put together.
Engaña con el movimiento alcista y retrocede.
Investment, jobs,
Creo que vamos a tener que buscar una vela de escape, sea al alza o a la baja, pero el movimiento creo que se define después que termine la entrevista de Powell. Por lo pronto no se define el movimiento. Tuvimos esta vela de escape a las 11:05, pero de ahí no necesitamos otra más, pero que ya se posicione en un rango en los 3.99. Y ya se posiciona en un rango por encima de 3.99. No hay a las puertas, pero no. Quiere y no quiere.
Not for me to judge the merits of what gets done, but I'm just saying there's
but it will
there's
contribute
there that will support economic
and support
activity.
it. Yeah. So I'm going to assume from that that's a positive. Let me go to the second question. Chairman Powell, the Federal Open Markets Committee is projecting that unemployment will increase to 4.6%.
¿Cómo va la diaria del SPY hasta el momento? Vamos a ver.
Those costs, as we know, won't be borne equally. If we look at the
respetando el 50 FIBO,
last time unemployment was 4.6% and compare it to our numbers now, it would mean that
no puede superar la media móvil 200 aquí.
0.9, but black
está alejadito de la 20.
By 2.3%. Does that sound somewhat accurate to you?
Yes.
Can you address the disparity?
A ver cómo viene el movimiento de verdad.
And before you answer, let me go to.
Lo va a hacer después que Powell termine de hablar.
That was put at our places together. You made a, in this
En
book,
5
your
minutos
signature,
estamos
you
buscando la
even
vela de
state,
escape y todavía
however,
no
while
está.
disparities in unemployment have largely returned to pre-pandemic
Todavía no hay
levels,
una vela de
there still
escape.
remain significant disparities in absolute levels of
Creo
employment
que el mercado le está dando
across
hasta
groups
sueño.
like African Americans and
Están deseando que
Hispanics.
terminen rápido esa
So
entrevista
can
con
you
Powell.
address that?
I can. So right now, to your point, actually, African-American unemployment is, I think, 5.4%, which is just about as low as it's been since we started tracking it in 1972.
But differential from majority
I'm
by.
going to say
Ojalá el precio nos coja, ojalá el precio tome aquí posición por encima de las dos medias móviles, de la 200 de la 50, antes de que haga el cruce en 5 minutos. Y lo tomen como soporte también. También sería una buena señal, una buena señal. Que lo tomen como soporte y el precio escape. El precio ahí escape. ¿Ok? Aunque se ha sostenido encima de la media móvil 20 en los últimos 15 minutos, aquí se ha sostenido por esta vela de las 11:05 que ha estado fuerte, ¿sí? Hoy es el 8 de marzo, yo por ahí le mandé felicitaciones a todas las mujeres. De verdad que sí, feliz Día Internacional de la Mujer. Feliz Día Internacional a todas. Todas las mujeres. A ver, la va a cerrar ya en 10 segundos. Vamos a ver.
I would like to see the areas that talks about unemployment not under a title of special topics, but something that draws
a ver cómo está esta vela.
As some of the others.
Pensaron que iba a haber movimiento más fuerte, hasta ahora no. Creo que el movimiento va a venir después que Powell termine de hablar. Creo que no va a ser ahora. Creo que va a ser cuando Powell termine la intervención. Que el mercado va a estar como que un poco más claro. Aunque tuvimos un movimiento fuerte aquí, a las 10 en punto de la mañana, eso absorbió y subió y bueno, rechazó un poco y se calmó. En el área interesante, ¿cuál área? 398, ahí se calmó. ¿Qué estamos esperando? Una vela de escape. Una vela de escape si va a hacer un movimiento al alza. O si va a hacer un movimiento de caída, pues también una vela de escape, pero que muestre algo y que no se esté ahí, que sí, que sí, que sí, que sí, que no, que no, que no, que no. Dice por ahí Enrique, AMD y Nvidia están en divergencia. Vamos a ver, mientras el movimiento se desarrolla. Nvidia. El movimiento ha estado alcista. Sí, pero puede mantenerse irracional. Se puede mantener irracional. Es la única que ha estado ahí en ese movimiento. Wow, AMD se ha escapado. Semiconductores se están escapando al alza. AMD en una zona bastante interesante, por encima de 86, hay probabilidades que vaya a los 90. Tiene velas sólidas, velas fuertes, escape. Desde que abrió la bolsa, señores, ha estado mostrando movimientos perfectos de drawback, sube, retrocede, soporta y vuelve y sube. Quizás ahorita retrocede y vuelve a subir. Vuelve a subir. Y Nvidia ya está que sube, bajó. Nvidia la tiene un poquito más difícil. En 5 minutos, Microsoft rechaza un doble techo, rechaza, es lo que tiene que ser el mercado un poquito así, indeciso para subir. A ver, Apple. Oye, creo que Apple va a mostrar, sí señores, bajos, no se soporta, que hace un movimiento alcista acá, de aquí empieza a subir. Después que retrocede aquí a este punto, es un alto que anterior era abajo, buen movimiento, vuelve y sube, se consolida aquí encima de la media móvil 20. Creo que va a haber un escape, O Nvidia en 15 minutos, hay más posibilidades de un put. Vamos a mirar.
In December, most Fed officials expected to lift rates this year to between 5 and 5.5%. Is that still your
Yo esperaría un doble techo a la zona de 2.41 para que me confirme
that
unas
the
entradas
durable
en
rate
put.
could be higher
Yo
than
esperaría que una
4%.
zona de doble techo en 15 minutos, por lo menos hasta aquí, hasta este precio. Hasta aquí, hasta los 2, sí, hasta los 2.41. Yo esperaría ahí una zona de doble techo a ver qué pasa. A ver qué sucede en 15 minutos. Vamos a ver cómo va ese movimiento. Oye, el mercado todavía sigue ahí en la zona de conflicto, eso sigue acumulándose. Ahorita está rechazando. Es que ese bloque, este bloque que tenemos aquí en 15 minutos está fuerte. Se ha mostrado muy fuerte ese bloque ahí. Se ha mostrado muy fuerte ese bloque, señores. Va a estar rechazando de nuevo otra vez, buscando el 3.98. No tenemos una vela de escape definida en 5 minutos. No tenemos todavía una vela definida de escape. A pesar de que el movimiento está ahí, que quiere, que sí, que no, que no.
From your prior practices, you're a consensus builder, Mr. Chairman. You pride yourself in that, and we credit you for being a consensus-oriented chairman. Will you commit to continuing that practice and not allow
Parece que tenemos más fuerza bajista en estos momentos.
Regulatory framework to be made by one person?
Vamos a ver si rompe el soporte.
Thank you. Earlier this year, you said, and I quote, "We are not and will not be a climate."
Vamos a ver qué pasa ahí si rompe el soporte o qué sucede.
In the Fed's draft principles on climate-related financial risks, one proposed principle suggested that boards of directors or of a financial institution should consider making changes to its compensation policies to align with values in the context of supposed climate risks.
Mercado todavía no se define.
That the Federal Reserve, through regulation, wants to begin implementing.
Hemos estado lateralizando toda la mañana.
So which is it? There seems to be a disconnect between your statements publicly and the rules that the board is putting forward for comment.
Well, I feel strongly that climate change is an important issue that needs to be addressed by elected people. It's just not something that we've been charged with by Congress, clearly. So we do have a narrow role, and that role will be around
haciendo fuerza bajista. 11:30, todavía Powell no lo dejan de entrevistar.
As I said before, we don't want to drift into becoming a climate policymaker, and we'll have to guard that border very carefully.
Regarding the Fed's climate scenario analysis pilot program, did the board vote to approve the creation of that pilot program?
You have to check, but I don't think so. I think it's
Los futuros se están acercando otra vez a la vela de apertura.
I'm concerned that one governor
rechazan en la vela de apertura.
Major policy changes without board consensus is a problem. And so I would urge you and your colleagues on the board.
Por debajo de la vela de apertura de nuevo los futuros.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to the
de nuevo por debajo.
House Intelligence Committee. Mr. Himes of Connecticut for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Chairman Powell. Thank you for your careful conduct of monetary policy, independent of the many political desires that circulate in this building. Independent monetary policy is a bedrock of a solid economy. I want to reflect for a moment on another bedrock of the American economy, the full faith and credit of the United States government, which is now being put at risk by the Republican majority. My Republican friends know how very dangerous a game they are playing. They know that salary payments to our soldiers are at risk. They know that their irresponsibility will raise mortgage rates for new home buyers.
Hace fuerza bajista,
This is the
perfora.
only time we focus on spending in the debt.
Vamos a ver si corta aquí, 3.98.10.
The time to focus on the deficit is when you are voting for the spending and the tax cuts that create the deficit.
Le están tirando duro.
When you're voting for the Trump tax cuts, which the CBO said would add $2 trillion to the national debt, that's the moment to consider whether you want to do that. Not when the good name of the United States is hanging in the balance. This stuff gets a little complicated, but the American people really need to understand what's happening here. The Congress sits down to a huge 10-course meal of tax cuts and spending and more defense spending and expansion of this program and stimulus, all of which we vote for collectively. First course, second course, white wine, red wine, 4 servings of dessert. And then the bill comes and my Republicans say, whoa, wait a minute, hold on, look at this bill. This is irresponsible. Do we really want to pay this bill?
Señores, le está tirando duro este congresista y el mercado está tomando muy en serio sus palabras.
A dessert. That's when we should be talking about it and taking
El mercado está reaccionando.
responsibility for the choices that we make without putting the full faith and credit of the United States at risk. Now here's where the hypocrisy comes in. My Republican friends like to point the finger at this side of the aisle and blame us. But Chairman, as you know, fully 1/4, 25% of today's United States debt was accrued in the 4 years of the Trump administration. This country's been around for 246 years, and fully 1/4 of the United States debt was accrued under President Trump. By the way, speaking of hypocrisy, in the 4 years of President Trump, the debt ceiling was raised or suspended 3 times. I didn't even notice. But now, of course, we have a different president, and so the calculus is different. Now, Mr. Chairman, I don't think I'm going to persuade the majority to act responsibly here. I actually think the markets will persuade them. And you'll recall, because we were watching this closely, September 29th, 2008, the Republican House of Representatives voted down the Great Recession Rescue Package. As the vote was going down,
lugar se dio la vuelta,
the equity market dropped
a un doble
7%.
techo.
$1.2
Ahí está en doble techo ahorita.
lost in people's
Igual que el SPY estará en doble
Now,
piso, ¿no?
Congress sobered up. A couple days
Ya.
later, we passed
La vela todavía no
the Rescue
cierra.
Act. So,
Estamos ahí en doble
Chairman, there's
piso,
a question here. The
absorbe.
question is this. You and I both watch the markets pretty closely. Treasury tells us that on June 5th, that's just 3 months away, on June 5th, the Treasury runs out of money. So my question
Ahora un
Mr.
poquito
Chairman, I'm
más, se
asking you to
mantiene ahí en el doble piso. Vamos a ver si lo
what should we
pierde.
watch for? What market signals could indicate that the markets are getting fed up with the manifest irresponsibility around this? Give us some things that we should be looking for.
Perforó más, señores. Ay, ay,
I'd love to, but I'm going to limit
Pierde doble piso.
have said about the debt ceiling, which is that
Dice Enrique, perforando envidia, pierde doble piso.
there are no rabbits in hats.
Pierde doble piso. El SPY perforando.
This is the Fed.
No sabemos si ya el movimiento se irá a dar real, porque realmente en 5 minutos lo que hemos estado lateralizando, igual que en 15 y en 1 hora,
We have the tools to protect
estamos perforando.
highly uncertain effects of that kind of an event.
So monetary policy is obviously
Estamos
concerned with
perforando en
interest
estos
rates.
momentos.
Global capital markets begin to decide that we're really serious about hurting ourselves this time. Is it possible that we could see
Y absorbe rápidamente.
rise more because borrowers of United States
Y ahora hace un cambio la onda de Helio, hace un cambio,
Is that possible?
porque estaba aquí, hace un cambio a esta vela más baja, si esta cierra hará un cambio y eso es lo que debilita las posibilidades de subir. Debilita un poco las posibilidades de subir.
So that's possible, and I don't like pressing you on these things.
Ahí absorbe más. Sin embargo, sabes que la mayor profundidad está en esta vela de acá, que son los 3.9683. Menos que esto venga a buscar un doble piso ahí.
Mr. Powell, again, I really
Sería,
thank you,
eso desataría
really responsible
ventas sobre el mercado.
policy, and there's a reason that you are insulated from our political
Y eso desataría ventas sobre el mercado, señores.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now recognize the chair of the Small Business Committee, Mr. Roger Williams of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman, it's good to see you, always good to have
Bueno, ¿y
you.
cuántos tienen que hablar? ¿Cuántos
In
son?
past congressional testimonies, you've repeatedly stated that you support protecting the state-based system.
¿Cuántos son los que tienen que hablar?
Which is the most effective and competitive in the world.
Lo han aguantado este mercado, señores. Mira cómo va absorbiendo de nuevo. Lo han aguantado.
Now, at the International Association for
Lo han
Insurance
estado aguantado. Nos tienen.
in November, there is the opportunity
Sí,
to have
que
the
no.
state-based aggregation method become
Que
formally
vamos para arriba, que vamos para abajo. Nada, lo tienen ahí.
to the insurance capital standard.
Lo tienen
We should not be following the
preso.
European model that
Ni a un lado ni a otro.
less competition, and we should prioritize a model that encourages deregulation, competition, and less government involvement in pricing. So my question is, Chairman, can you highlight the benefits
Y el dólar rechazando.
aggregation method?
Ahí está el dólar rechazando por doble techo.
Market resiliency and systematic risk. And
A ver si pierde este piso aquí de estas velitas acá.
deemed equivalent by the
Y nos mostrará si pierde el piso.
I can say this.
Entonces,
I do think that our
los
insurance
futuros
regulatory system has proven
también están haciendo un piso interesante. Ya quieren reaccionar al alza.
other countries or other regions insurance regulatory system. I'm a little rusty on
A ver.
the details of the capital requirements, but That sounds right.
But our, bottom line is, our side works, the other doesn't. We need to stay where we are.
Our side works.
Yeah, thank you. Also, in the past,
A
you
ver
stated
ahí.
that banks were well capitalized.
Esto da confianza por encima de los
Now
4.000.
there have been increased conversations
Debajo de
about
4.000,
raising capital
la sensación es
requirements.
bajista.
Numerous economic studies have found
Mismo
that
el
raising
SPY,
capital
confianza por
requirements
encima de
banks will increase
3.99.
borrowing
Esa
costs
es la
for
confianza que
and
necesitamos.
commercial customers, and I'm somebody that's owned 50 years. I've never had a day I wasn't out of debt, so I'm concerned about this. And implementing additional regulatory capital requirements will slow economic growth and limit financial institutions' lending ability. So, do you believe that raising capital
La confianza que
requirements would
necesitamos,
raise the cost
señores.
of borrowing and add cost to our economy in Main Street America?
Well, it depends on which banks experience higher capital requirements, and there isn't any proposal to
Todavía nada.
now, of course, but it's always a trade-off. You know, higher capital is good in
Movimiento lento y casi muerto. Ahí están los futuros de nuevo, sobrepasando la vela
too much capital, though.
de apertura de ayer a las 6 de la tarde. De nuevo otra vez.
And this has been touched on a little today, but let me.
Han estado moviéndose en esa
The
área.
Reserve was created to act as a nonpartisan entity that remains separate from.
Han estado moviéndose en esa área,
Unfortunately,
señor.
throughout recent years, the Fed has gotten caught up in politically charged issues like economic inequality, gender and race discrimination, and climate change. Recently, the Federal Reserve Board proposed guidance on managing climate-related risks for large banks, further proving that the Fed is giving in to some political pressure and operating outside its intended purpose and responsibilities. So our country's financial leaders, in my mind, should be focusing on addressing runaway inflation.
El SPY hace una absorción muy parecida a esta vela acá, muy parecida a esta vela aquí. Todavía no cierra la vela, cierran unos segundos. Vamos a ver si sigue la trayectoria.
I think it's absolutely critical that we do. I mean, our independence is partly founded on the idea that we will stay out of stuff that you have not assigned us to do. And if we're going to wander all over and take on the hot issue of the day, our case for...
Vamos a ver si sigue la trayectoria.
On climate change, I think we do, you mentioned the guidance, and then there are also the stress scenarios, and those are the two things that we've done. We tried to keep those tightly focused on the banks, understanding and being able to manage the risks that they'll run over the longer time periods on climate, and not slide into a broader sort of policy-making role on climate change. And I accept that could be a slippery slope and a moving border. And I just want to say, and I think my colleagues feel the same way on the board, that we're going to guard that border carefully, and we're going to stick to our role and not try to be policymakers the way in many
Well, está ahí que sí, que esto, vamos a ver.
with the support of the public doing climate policy, but that's not where we are in the United States, and we're not going to pretend that it is.
I've got some time left, and I'll yield back, but I just want to say, as an auto dealer, I'm looking for the first day of that rate cut. So, thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Ya todo debe estar llegando a su final. Debe estar llegando a su final esta intervención.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for holding this hearing. Chairman Powell, a pleasure to see you again. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. It's always great to see you because I always
De nuevo encima de 398.
the ones who are very noble, did the right thing, didn't play chicken with the economy, very forthright. And so anyway, I appreciate you being here very much. Like some of my colleagues on the other side, I'd say the same thing about some of them, and I appreciate you. So we heard today that the inflation is Biden's fault. So what is the inflation rate in the European Union today?
It's high.
It's high. Is it 10% possibly?
I think if you're talking about headline, I don't have this figure in my head, but it's very, very high from a headline standpoint. And they've had core.
Is that what caused the inflation? Because it seems to be Biden's fault.
So I think inflation is everywhere, and it must have
A ver.
a common factor, and that common factor has to be the reopening of the economy after, and the things that were done on COVID. On the other hand, each country has a little bit different case, and I think you have to be careful. We had much more of a demand-oriented issue.
Queremos superar el bloquecito de 15 minutos.
Their inflation looks a lot like ours did a year ago.
Es el que no hemos podido
Yeah,
superar. Ahí
I
está.
just had to bring it up because again,
Mira que se ha mantenido por encima del 3.98. Ahí.
I wonder why is it all over the world? I mean, it's not.
Pero no ha podido superar ese bloque.
Europe's at war. I mean, that wouldn't cause it.
Movimientos engañosos para ambos lados.
Voters saw through it last time. So I haven't been here.
Movimientos engañosos para ambos lados.
Mr. Foster, I've only been here 11. But when I first got here,
movimiento que engaña a la baja, movimiento que engaña al alza.
On the other side was Dodd-Frank.
Todavía no se define.
End of banking. And in fact, some of my colleagues would almost scream how horrible this was. And then we got the bankers up here during a real stress test, which was the pandemic. And we asked them, has it been helpful to have Dodd-Frank? And you know what they said? Do you know what they said?
I don't.
Oh, they said it was helpful. In fact, it kept the banks capitalized. It was fascinating. Now, to be fair to them, they did complain about some of the smaller issues, but not Dodd-Frank in general, the bill. Then it seemed that CFPB became the next
SPY en 15.
They're starting to,
mientras no superemos este bloque, ¿cuál es la parte alta de este bloque?
CFPB has actually helped so many people. And now a lot of their
3.9918.
now are getting helped by the CFPB.
Número mágico.
There's not quite the energy.
Pero me
So
gusta
now
que
they're attacking ESG.
esta conexión aquí ha
And they're
estado
saying
así.
that you and everybody else
Si lo hacemos bien,
somehow
vamos a hacerlo.
conspiring to make sure they don't buy their oil or their coal. Are you conspiring to do that?
Vamos a hacerlo aquí.
Are you conspiring?
I don't believe we're conspiring.
No. Now I
Te darás cuenta, tú estás formando un
Is there risk in the climate?
triángulo. Un triángulo en resistencia.
Could it affect the bank?
Aquí así.
Certainly, in the longer run, yes.
Que necesita ser superado.
Insurance companies take this into account?
Necesita ser superado.
I believe they do.
They absolutely do.
Who write long duration liabilities, they certainly do.
Of course they do. I mean, they're very
Ese
concerned.
bloque necesita ser superado.
Weather is a big deal. I was a vice president of Liberty Mutual in their corporate legal department, and I can tell you weather and the changing of the weather, we used to have what we call catastrophes. And these catastrophes happen every 25, 50, 100 years. Now those 25, 50, and 100-year events happen
No, hay
every
15
5
minutos que está haciendo lo demás. El SPX
I mean, it's
también está en la misma
ridiculous
acumulación.
not to take a look at these ESG
Todavía no ha habido aquí un escape. Nada.
And again, I'm glad that you guys are taking a look
Bitcoin
at
pierde un
this
poquito.
I'm
Ya.
glad that, you know, the
Bitcoin
president's
retrocede.
taking a look at it. And
El
it's
dólar en
sad
15
that my
minutos,
colleagues on the other
mucho
side
techo
stick
también.
their head in the sand and say,
Ambos
"No,
están en
climate
techo, tanto el
change
mercado
is
como el dólar.
climate change." No, the reality
Mucho
is
techo
it's
para los
climate
dos.
change, and it's costing billions and billions of dollars. And if you don't believe it, go ask all those poor people in Florida that had those huge hurricanes come through and wipe them out.
Para los futuros,
So again, I appreciate very much the work
también
you've
mucho
done.
techo.
The only thing I hope is, as you said, if
Mucho techo. Necesita confirmar por encima de los 4.000. Es lo que le da confianza. Mientras se sigue ahí en una resistencia ahí, 3.995.
I yield back.
Gentleman's time, gentleman yields back. Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go
El
to
VIX, por su
Caera Oversight
parte,
Subcommittee.
empeñado en caer. Bien. Si el VIX cae, si el VIX está empeñado en caer,
Thank you,
vamos.
Mr. Chairman. I'm going to move
Apple,
quickly, and good to see you again.
Aguantado.
You know, I
Amazon en
caught a
15
little bit of the
minutos.
Senate hearings yesterday, and you had a lot of pressure.
Amazon en 15 minutos. Quiere ser alcista.
And many of our
Google en 15 minutos. Bien, buen movimiento. Nvidia recuperándose. Ojo con el doble techo a la zona de 2.41 en 15 minutos. Ojo ahí. Ojo ahí. Eso está bueno. Ojo ahí en ese movimiento en 15 minutos. Ojo con ese movimiento ahí en 15 minutos que vamos bien. Claro, movimiento, vuelvo y te digo, viene ahí después que Powell termine.
And here you got folks wanting to do the exact same thing.
A ver,
Let's
¿qué
spend
más?
more.
Microsoft se recupera o no en 15. Sí, está mostrando una leve recuperación. Necesitamos posicionarnos por encima de la media móvil 20, por lo menos acercarnos al 255 sería buen síntoma.
Tightening means a slower economy. Slower economy means
Ya
fewer
buen
jobs, fewer
síntoma
jobs hit those who can least
para
afford to lose their
Microsoft.
jobs. And so in short,
Meta.
the lower rungs of the economic
No,
ladder
está moviendo
suffer
centavitos,
more
poquito,
than the
doble
rest of them.
techo, tiene que superar un doble techo si quiere abrir desplazamiento alcista. Y Tesla,
That's the state of play of where we're at.
no, Tesla
I
la
have to
tienen
hit a
ahí.
couple of quick issues
Creo
here.
que Tesla no va a
I
hacer
wanted to
nada
start
hoy.
off by discussing
Oye,
climate.
Apple ya en
As
zona de
we know, the Fed's announcement
153 de
January to
nuevo.
conduct a pilot climate
Vamos a ver
scenario
si hace una
analysis
vela de
exercise.
escape y nos
The Fed, along with
muestra
the
que se
OCC
va.
and FDIC, have each issued
Nos
proposed
muestra que
climate
se
risk
va.
management principles for banks that you are attempting to finalize those by the end of the year. And the requirements don't stop at the border. The UK and the
Nos
EU
muestra
central
que se
banks are
va.
moving to require significant ESG disclosure.
Y el mercado en zona de 3.99, vamos a ver si supera el bloque y nos dice que también se va. 3.99,18 es la parte alta de ese bloque. Necesita ganar ese bloque, ganarlo. Necesita ganarlo para irse alcista. Ahí está, señores. Bien, bien, no nos engañes, no te devuelvas, mantente. Mantente para que ya busques un rumbo hoy. Para que busques un rumbo hoy. Para que busques un rumbo hoy, pero mira, ahí está rechazando de nuevo. Ahí está rechazando. No queremos que rechaces. Antes, al contrario, que ya muestres una tendencia.
We're going to follow up on that because we need to have.
Bien, está alcanzando el máximo del día en 15 minutos.
I want to quickly switch topics and go to different.
Ahora que el mercado está hablando de nuevo, los futuros encima de 4.000 generan confianza, pero eso es un techo. Eso es un techo, es un bloque que tienen que saber comportarse, posicionarse por encima, van, los tocan, retroceden. No, tiene que mantenerse, tiene que mantenerse. Hay que mantenerse por encima de los 4.000, por encima de los 4.000. Encima de los 4.000 para que genere entonces, próxima vela en 15 minutos, genere la confianza que se necesita. Pero que no venga a ser un desgaste o un rechazo de nuevo, porque no, honestamente entonces no sería agradable. No sería agradable ahí en esa parte. Simplemente estaríamos moviéndonos que cada vez que llega aquí hay que hacer venta y cuando llega acá abajo hay que hacer compra. Básicamente estaría moviéndose así. ¿No? Mira, ahí está rechazando. Lo mismo está pasando entonces en el SPY. Cada vez que toca el bloque, bueno, esta vez lo está superando. Esta vez no ha rechazado todavía en vela de 15 minutos. Veamos en vela de 5. Vamos en vela de 5 si hay escape o no hay escape. Ahí está nuestro moderador felicitando a todas las chicas de la academia. Parece que hay escape. Parece que ahí estábamos esperando esta vela de escape hace rato. Esperemos que esa sea la vela correcta. La vela de escape sea esa. Sea la vela de escape.
Honestly, that's a very specific, narrow question. I'm quite familiar with the issue.
Well, it's specific and narrow to two companies, but not to an
Esa sea
industry.
la vela de escape.
I mean, that's what we need to be driving.
Cierre ahí.
And
Bueno, aunque de pronto quizás,
we need to find
¿qué
out
pasaría ahora? Que el movimiento vuelve y rechaza. Tenemos un peligro. Tenemos un peligro. Doble techo.
So,
doble
how often do
techo.
you think they should be reassessed?
¿Ustedes saben lo que eso significa? De que el movimiento cayó, hace doble techo, que podemos estar frente a esto. Necesitamos que la vela cierre por encima del doble techo. Cerrando por encima del doble techo, la cosa se pone diferente.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Powell for joining us today. Chairman Powell, when you testified before the committee last June, PCE inflation was up 6.3% year over year. Just a few weeks ago,
A ver, vamos a ver, ahí está, tomando fuerza alcista.
We're moving in the right direction, but despite the Federal Reserve raising interest rates at the highest rate since October 2007, we're still far off from the 2% inflation that the Federal Reserve is targeting. Do you believe 2% is still the right target for inflation? And given the ongoing energy transition, the push to shift supply chains out of China, and the labor shortage here in the U.S., should the Fed consider adjusting its target to avoid overly burdening
El SPY no pasa la zona de 400 todavía, se acerca pero no.
That excessive economic pain?
No, 2% inflation is going to
Se
remain.
acerca pero no.
Are you concerned given all the other factors that I mentioned, or do you think we just have to keep sticking with that?
I think that's got to remain our longer-term inflation goal. It's the global standard, and it's our standard, and this is not a time at which we can start talking about changing it. We have no instinct to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gig economy has grown significantly in recent years as more Americans are working as contractors or running small businesses. The Dallas Federal Reserve has written that
Si el movimiento descansa en esta vela antes de irse.
among the unemployed, and this may understate the number of Americans who could be counted as unemployed. The Fed has also noted the large number of Americans who are missing from the workforce after the pandemic. Do we need to change the way we think about measuring unemployment to account for these changes?
I missed the word you're saying.
Sorry, do you think we need to change the way we think about measuring unemployment to account for these changes?
I didn't catch this. You said, what was the word?
Gig, oh, sorry, gig, gig workers.
Gig
Yes, I'm sorry,
I didn't
gig workers.
hear that. That's the word I didn't hear. Okay. No, we clearly need to incorporate gig workers.
A ver si se define este movimiento.
And to whether they're working, and they certainly are working. We try to do that. It's not that we're not trying to do that. We may not be doing it perfectly.
Is there a better way to capture them? Just worried that you don't have, the unemployment numbers may not, given we're still using older.
No queremos doble techo porque eso es,
Updating our measurement.
We absolutely try.
por lo menos que cierre un poquito más arriba del doble techo,
They do report in the house.
para que haga siquiera una pequeña diferencia, pero si no, estamos fritos.
We're not doing a perfect job at it because it's a
Porque doble techo,
very well aware of it, and they're supposed to be included.
doble techo, no.
Great, I'd love to talk to you more about that. Great, thank you. As you're also aware, many of us are having
A ver si
discussions
lo
about the
consigue, si
long-term
lo
fiscal
logra,
health of our country and our economy.
si se lo
Like me, I
propone.
worry that higher interest rates will put upward pressure on the national debt. CBO already estimates that annual interest costs will nearly triple for the U.S. over the next decade. You said to the Senate yesterday that interest payments are not a consideration of the Fed, but are you concerned that higher interest rates will more rapidly make payments on the debt unsustainable? And are there actions Congress should consider to address this issue?
So I'll say what my predecessors have said, which is that we're on an
Sí,
unsustainable
estamos en un doble techo, señores.
Ultimately, we will get back on a sustainable path, and the sooner we get to work on that.
Estamos en un doble techo.
And rates, of course, were low between the
Ya
financial
estamos
crisis
en un
and
doble techo, no
2021,
nos gusta.
low, after the target inflation rates
Doble
hit.
techo.
What do you think the new normal looks like in
En
terms of
5
rates on the
minutos.
Fed balance sheet over the next 5 to 10 years?
Parece que la onda,
There was a secular
aquí
decline
estuvimos en la onda A,
we don't control for 40
estuvimos en
years.
la onda
to the
A,
point where they were, where the
por
10
ondas de helio estuvimos en A,
was at 10%.
B,
At the end of 40
y ahora
years,
C, si quiere consolidar
you're at
aquí,
higher levels,
si
you're
quiere
at
lanzar un
higher levels
movimiento
than we've seen
bajista
since earlier
por doble
century.
techo, ese es el
I think
detalle.
anybody knows what this is going
Hicimos
to look
doble
like,
techo,
5 years down the road.
movimiento
So you have to ask
no nos gusta porque la vela cerró anteriormente en doble techo, una vela que puede estar abriendo un patrón de estrella del atardecer. Eso generaría un movimiento bajista. Eso generaría un movimiento bajista.
Building on that a little bit, what's the right metric you think for, if you're in our shoes, for assessing our fiscal health? Do you think
Eso generaría un movimiento bajista,
debt to
señores.
GDP ratio, or is there a specific number? Are there other measures lawmakers should be focusing on?
So we've traditionally focused on debt to GDP, but many people pointed out before the pandemic that rates were secularly lower and that therefore you could look at sort of real debt service.
El dólar también tuvo que haber llegado entonces a doble piso
Actually, debt service was much more easy to handle.
y ahora está otra vez siendo alcista, aunque está en doble techo también, igual que el mercado. Los futuros también llegaron al doble techo, retroceden. Los futuros llegaron al doble techo y retroceden.
You're going back to a higher level, so it won't be that big of a change. I think it's more or less been handled, for example, by CBO that way.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Now I'll go to the gentleman, the Vice Chair of the Digital Assets Subcommittee, the Chair of the.
Y es posible entonces que el movimiento se venga ahí y venga haciendo.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Powell, thank you. It's an honor to be able to talk with you today and appreciate the work you and the monetary policy-focused portion of the Fed does. We're rooting for
Que sigue haciendo, las demás compañías se recuperan, siguen, no siguen.
regulators. So for the regulatory side, I've spoken with multiple bankers.
Apple se detiene aquí.
That they've never seen a higher degree of
En
regulatory
5 minutos Apple se detiene. A ver, ¿qué está haciendo?
shaping
Amazon, bueno, bien. Está viendo un movimiento de descanso ahorita.
Just narrowly focused on the Fed.
Amazon también quizás, wow, Amazon la tiene difícil porque si no logra hacer un alto más alto en esta temporalidad, cambia la tendencia. Nvidia, estuvimos hablando ahí de un doble rechazo por doble techo, ya lo estuvimos hablando, ahí está acercándose a esa zona de doble techo, ahí puede estar la cuestión. Microsoft bien, es la que está liderando un poquito el movimiento, ojalá no se le agote y ayude un poco más ahí. Y ayude un poco más ahí. Meta, ok, llegando a 184, se devuelve. Tesla, nada, Tesla está indecisa hoy. Tesla está indecisa. Así que ahí está de nuevo el movimiento entonces aquí en el market.
They don't trust it. I mean, the unbanked and the underbanked, fundamentally, that's lack of trust is part of why they don't use our banking system today. In fact, that's part of the appeal of the digital asset space, is the permissionless nature of it.
Hizo doble techo, el movimiento está rechazando, señor.
In the financial services space that have grown up in it, that are leading it today, feel threatened.
El movimiento rechaza por doble techo, no lo queríamos, pero no está en nuestras manos, ¿verdad? No está en nuestras manos que el movimiento haya rechazado por doble techo. Ahorita se ve obligado el movimiento a bajar. Ojalá, por lo menos de pronto quizás hasta la media móvil 20 y ahí se detenga un poco, pero si el movimiento se ve obligado a bajar,
I mean, if you don't
se ve
comply with the
obligado a bajar.
regulatory regime, you don't get to operate a financial services business, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And so at the end of the day, you know, I think a lot of people were concerned by your remarks yesterday. I know I was, by saying that permissionless digital assets pose a systemic risk to the financial system.
Well, what I think what we said in our guidance, I think
Vamos a ver cómo viene esta vela.
through the digital guidance, which I did getting ready for this hearing. Of course, I read it before we put it out the first time. But
Abre otra velita más, pero
we don't want regulation
no genera la confianza alcista.
and thus entrench incumbents and things
No
like
genera
that.
la confianza
Pretty
alcista,
balanced
señores.
language, and I think it essentially goes to the question of protecting the safety and soundness of institutions. And there is one, I think what we say about, I'll paraphrase it, what we say about permissionless blockchain is that they have been vehicles for fraud.
Yeah, 0.24%.
Está queriendo hacer alcista, vamos a ver.
Your own report on fraud, it's a fraction of what it is with the U.S. dollar. So speaking of the dollar, is there any real current threat to the dollar's preeminence as the world's reserve currency?
No rechaza.
You're asking a question. I didn't.
Yes, sir.
Is there a real threat?
Is there a threat?
I think that our status as the world's reserve currency is not under particularly strong threat right now. I think it's a pretty stable equilibrium. It's not a permanent equilibrium, but there isn't really a serious competitor, and that's not.
Vamos a ver qué está haciendo Apple en este movimiento. Déjame mirar en 5 minutos. Apple está en una zona también conflictiva, posiblemente de rechazo. Posiblemente de rechazo ahí. De la indecisión, que sí, que no.
As the chairman of Housing and Insurance, I'm particularly concerned about affordable housing and the artificial prop for the mortgage-backed securities does raise the
Ya
cost.
estuvimos ahí. Lo que nos mató en el SPY fue el doble techo y que está perdiendo fuerza. Bueno, Apple ahí se encuentra, quizás, mira, ahí está rechazando un poco Apple. No, aquí también está rechazando, también está rechazando, en este caso, Amazon. Creo que Google no siguió, no, pierde fuerza Google, tenía que haber superado un alto más alto. Y eso nos está matando aquí. Nvidia acaba de llegar al doble techo. Nvidia acaba de llegar, en 15 minutos acaba de llegar al doble techo. También eso es una zona decisiva. de mucha decisión para Nvidia. Microsoft también rechaza ahorita en esta vela de 5 minutos, ha empezado a rechazar.
We had more workers than jobs. From 17 until the COVID crisis was about the same.
Empezado ahí a rechazar Microsoft, aunque superó un bloquecito. Ojalá no pierda este bloque rápidamente, que tiene ahorita como soporte y no lo vaya a perder. Y lo vaya a convertir después en resistencia de nuevo y le cueste entonces superar. Ahí lo viene perforando lentamente. Bueno, dejemos tranquila por hoy a Meta y a Nvidia. Y a Meta y a Tesla, perdón. Pero seguimos entonces vigilando a Microsoft, seguimos vigilando a Amazon, a Apple, a Google, Nvidia, obviamente, ¿no? ¿Qué tenemos acá? Apple, la vela rechazando. La vela rechazando ahí. Vamos a ver si se aguanta, si se aguanta, si se aguanta. Vamos a ver. Vamos a ver. Pero no me gustó el doble techo que hizo el SPY, siendo alcista, ¿no? Mira que lo tienen ahí ahorita con un sentimiento bajista. Lo tienen ahí con un sentimiento bajista. Lo tienen ahí con un sentimiento bajista que puede venir a buscar la media móvil, las dos medias móviles. Son de 398.90. Aunque nos gustaría que se mantenga ahí encima en el 399, ¿no? Para que nos dé confianza. Para que nos dé confianza a los 400. Si lo hace, nos da la confianza a los 400, ¿no? Nos da la confianza a los 400. Así que eso es lo que estamos mirando, lo que estamos observando en estos momentos, que siga respetando ahorita el 391. Si tomó el 398 como zona de rango durante mucho tiempo, pues bueno, que tome ahorita entonces el 399 y se mantenga ahí. Se mantenga ahí, se mantenga ahí. Se mantenga ahí siendo, ¿cómo es? Alcista por encima de esa parte, ¿no? Abre otra vela más. Vamos a ver cómo es la reacción de la apertura de esta vela. Y quizás dará la esperanza de sí, que no, que no.
No, and to be clear, like we're all opposed to inflation here, but in that 2010 to 2020 period that we all viewed as a very low inflationary period, wages, the gains from productivity did not flow to labor. Wages did not keep up with inflation. And we didn't think about that as a problem for the Fed to fix because overall inflation was down. So, I mean, this gets sort of theoretical, but let's say that we had 6% wage inflation and 5% CPI. There'd be more money in people's
Siguen entrevistando a Powell. Señores, ¿será que esta gente no tiene hambre?
To clamp down on, because we didn't view the inverse as a problem, if you will.
So our job is to restore price.
Ni agua ha tomado Powell, señor. Ni agua. Ahí está el sentimiento entonces siendo bajista en esta parte. Ahí está la vela.
We think about price stability, and when we think about price stability, we think about wages as an important input to that. But we're not targeting a particular level of price.
Ahí viene la vela perforando.
That we don't want real wages to go up.
Vamos a ver qué hace con las dos medias móviles. Vamos a ver qué hace con las dos medias móviles. Si las perfora en 5 minutos, no bueno. No bueno para mí.
Globalization and the advance of technology and educational and skills and aptitude and all those things. That's what drives productivity. That's what drives, labor share.
Yeah, and it's hard to have these conversations in 5 minutes, I realize.
Happy to follow up.
I guess what's hard is that, also in that 2010 to 2020 period, median home prices went up by 50%. Yeah. We didn't view that as inflationary. 401ks went up a lot. We didn't view that as
sentimiento bajista de nuevo.
And so, as we have shifted the gains from people who had wealth to people who were dependent on wages, there needs to be some correction, and I leave it there because I'm out of time. But how we think about
Gentleman's
that.
Time's expired.
Thank you. Go back.
We'll now go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, for 5 minutes.
Thank you for being with us today, Chairman Powell. Chair Powell, I just want to echo at the outset some of the concerns that my colleagues have raised about Vice Chair Michael Barr's
Y es del 3.99, no queríamos eso.
holistic review, unquote, of
No
capital
queríamos que
markets,
perdiera el
and also
3.99,
about the
¿no?
Fed engaging in climate policy, as well as your decision to put Vice Chair Barr in charge of the Community Reinvestment Act rulemaking.
La
With that said,
estructura
I
ahí
wanna dive
está
right into my
siendo
questions.
bajista.
Chair Powell, I was pleased to see that the U.S. Coin Task Force released their report on the state of coin a few months ago. The report notes that the Federal Reserve and U.S. Mint will be jointly contracting with a third-party consultant to review the coin supply chain and develop recommendations to improve it. Chairman Powell, could you provide us with an update on what the Fed has learned from its review of the coin circulation issues that occurred during the pandemic?
So the,
Ahí viene, señores, la vela viene siendo sólida. No tiene una mecha de absorción todavía. La vela viene siendo sólida a la baja. Vuelvo y te digo, básicamente hemos estado en un rango 3.99, 3.98, 3.99, 3.98. No hemos salido de ahí. Ni siquiera hemos vuelto al 3.97 o al 3.96. Ahora estamos en un rango de 3.98, 3.99. ¿No? Lo vamos entonces a estar concluyendo es que estamos, sí, aquí para que tengas una ilustración de lo que está pasando. Vemos esta línea y la clonamos y hacemos una clonación y la llevamos aquí a la parte alta. Mira el canal, ahí se ve claramente el canal en el que estamos en 5 minutos en el FY. Hemos tocado la parte baja del canal y absorbemos. O sea que puede venir a tocar la parte baja del canal de nuevo y absorbe al alza. O puede estar muy cerca. Puede estar muy cerca de la parte baja del canal y absorbe. ¿Sí? Puede estar muy cerca de la parte baja del canal y absorbe en 5 minutos. Y absorbe. ¿Sí? Mira, ahí está el sentimiento.
We think it's absolutely critical because there are people who don't have credit cards. Many people don't have credit cards. They don't have good credit and they need to be paying in cash.
Eso es lo que tenemos básicamente entonces para
Not dealing with people who don't have cash. It's a serious problem for
para el FPY hasta el momento, ¿no? Otra vela más, cierra una vela sólida, muy bajista, muy bajista. Muy bajista después de este sentimiento de caída.
Thank you. I appreciate that perspective. Picking up on Mr. Lukemeier's concerns that he expressed earlier, as you know,
parece que viene a la parte baja, aquí a esta línea, pero esta lineecita por aquí, viene a la parte baja. Está haciendo los movimientos alcistas, pero desde que hizo el doble techo, ahí fue donde no generó la confianza. Ahí no generó la confianza. ¿Qué están haciendo en 5 minutos las demás compañías? Mira, Apple liquida. Bueno, mientras no perdamos la media móvil 20, puedes respirar esperanza un poquito. También están las dos medias móviles Amazon con tendencia alcista. Simplemente hay un movimiento de descanso. El tema de Google también en 5 minutos está encima de la media móvil 20, pero le tocaría ahorita superar este mínimo anterior y este máximo anterior. Le tocaría superar los dos. Le tocaría superar los dos. Para Nvidia, bueno, ya sabemos, ¿no? Tocó el doble techo y reaccionó. Obviamente, eso es normal. Eso es una reacción normal en doble techo. Vamos a ver hasta dónde reposar el movimiento bajista. Microsoft, bueno, también se nos debilitó. Está entre medio de las dos medias móviles. A ver qué sucede. Los futuros, por su parte. Aquí se me actualiza el perfil de volumen. Los futuros, por su parte, en vela de 5 minutos, nuevamente, doble techo. Míralo ahí clarito. Doble techo, y este doble techo lo lanzó siendo bajista. Y si lo ves en 15 minutos, te vas a dar cuenta de algo más, todavía más fuerte, que la vela de 15 minutos viene siendo más grande que la vela anterior de 15 minutos. Esta vela está con más fuerza a la baja, aunque se está soportando ahí. 3.990, 3.990, se está soportando ahí, 3.990, 3.990. Vamos a ver, ojalá no llegue a la vela de apertura, 3.988, ahí viene 3.990.
This kitchen table crisis across the country. With that, Chairman, I yield back.
Now recognize the
Ahí
gentleman
viene
from
entonces, mira lo que
Massachusetts, Mr.
estamos
Presley.
viendo en estos momentos.
Thank you, Chairman Powell, for joining us today and for your testimony.
Mira, ahí viene. Creo que va a tocar la vela de apertura. Se dispara, sí señor, y perfora más. Y perfora mucho más. Ahora, esta vela de 15 minutos, todavía le faltan 2 minutos para el cierre. Todavía le faltan 2 minutos para el cierre. En 15 minutos, ya sé que mi parte más baja todavía del día es 3.974. Eso ahí es un área muy importante. Ahora, viene perforando, viene bajando. Todavía Powell no termina la entrevista, pero nosotros sí vamos a terminar el en vivo. Pues si Powell no le da hambre, a mí sí me da hambre. Y sí me da hambre. Él ni agua ha tomado desde que está en esa entrevista. Ni agua, señor. El movimiento ahí está cayendo en 15 minutos. Vamos a ver entonces cómo se comporta a lo que cierre esta vela en 15 minutos y si el movimiento entonces rechazó ahí en la vela de entrada los 3.988 de nuevo rechaza ahí, está bien que haya rechazado, está bien que haya rechazado ahí en esa parte.
Chairman Powell, many economists agree with me when I say that engineering a recession to bring inflation under control
Vamos a ir
is not
organizando,
the right strategy.
vamos a ir organizando los movimientos, ¿no? Para después que Powell termine.
In real time, independent of
Ya no
your
organiza los
ratings.
movimientos para después que Powell
So on
termine.
behalf of the people of this
Como
country,
no hemos vuelto a la zona del 4.000 y no hemos regresado a la zona del 400, estamos en la parte más baja del canal, tanto en 15 minutos como en 5 minutos. Estamos en una parte más baja del canal. Queremos ver si va a haber rechazo. Oye bien, si va a haber un rechazo ahí en 15 minutos o si va a romper el canal. Si rompe el canal, entonces ya sabes que el movimiento continuará cayendo, buscando otra vez el mínimo del día. Ahí también hay toma de decisiones por doble piso. ¿Okay? Allí hay toma de decisiones por doble piso. Ya esta vela va a cerrar en 3 segundos. Bueno, cierra la vela y mira, llega a la parte más baja de nuestro canal. ¿Sí? La vela empieza a perforar. Llega a la parte más baja de nuestro canal en 5 y en 15 minutos. Ahí lo tenemos. Está ahí peleando. Lo mismo los futuros, creo que también están ahí. Pero tienen más fuerza bajista que alcista. Tienen más fuerza. Esta vela pesa mucho. Esta vela no se había visto en 15 minutos desde que la bolsa abrió. Esta vela de cuerpo sólido pesa demasiado. Y ya por debajo de 400 no lo logró con las palabras de Powell, con todo lo que le han dicho, lo han atacado, la respuesta que ha dado, todo. Ya esta vela de escape pesa demasiado, pesa mucho y lo que está lanzando es un movimiento bajista. Lo que está lanzando es un movimiento bajista que puede venir a buscar un doble piso. Puede venir a buscar un doble piso. Entonces, eso es lo que yo voy a tener en cuenta. Eso es lo que yo voy a tener en cuenta porque está rompiendo el canal. Está rompiendo el canal. No reaccionó, aunque todavía le queda mucho tiempo a la vela. No se preocupe, todavía le queda mucho tiempo a la vela. Puede considerarse de que ahí está retrocediendo, mira. Ahí está retrocediendo, los futuros otra vez superan la vela de inicio. La vela de inicio la superan, pero eso todavía no nos da una tranquilidad, todavía no nos da una confianza. ¿Por qué? Porque esta vela pesa demasiado. Pesó demasiado esa vela, señores, pero mucho. Mucho pesó esa vela. ¿Ok?
One more question.
Es un movimiento falso al alza y ahora está bajito. Y ahora está bajito.
Double of what it was 2 years ago. Do you see this widening inequity in the housing market as a problem? And what steps will you take to make housing more affordable? This is putting home ownership further and further out of reach.
Tabela pesa demasiado. Puede venir Tabela aquí a buscar la zona 397.
People of color,
Está absorbiendo.
to inequities and the racial wealth
Venía a buscar la
gap.
zona del 397. Si decide romper el canal, pero si se define esta vela de 15 minutos ahorita dentro del canal y queda arribita del canal, o sea, queda ya por encima de este canal, podemos estar tranquilamente, porque si lo bajamos a 5 minutos vamos a entenderlo mejor. Lo bajamos a 5 minutos, vemos de que la vela anterior, la que cerró a las 2:10, de 2:10 a 2:15, cerró ahí en la línea, exactamente en la línea, y que el cuerpo de esta vela se está desarrollando ahí, está desarrollando ahí, se está desarrollando encima de la línea. ¿Será momento entonces, será que de pronto para coger una entrada en largo, así rapidito, un scalping? Vamos a esperar si esta vela cierra ahí, el movimiento podría darse, si cierra por encima de la línea roja. Hay altas probabilidades de que sea un movimiento de scalping. ¿Okay? Hay probabilidades de que sea un movimiento de scalping. Para entender entonces lo que está pasando. Pueda que sí, mira, lo estamos viendo. Ahí lo estamos viendo. Pueda que sí suceda eso. Míralo, ahí va.
Briefly, let's go over some history. Social Security was created in 1937. The retirement age then was 65.
Ahí va el movimiento.
Was 60. Easy to see how that math works. In 1960, Congress raised the retirement age to 67. It has not been increased since then. That year, life expectancy was 69. That math still works due to a growing population, but it's getting narrower. I will throw in another few statistics for that year.
El movimiento de esta vela se está cerrando por encima de la línea roja, así del canal. Está bien.
Let's fast forward to this year.
Vale, le quedan todavía unos segundos al cierre.
Life expectancy is 77. That math clearly does not work, nor is the program functioning in the purpose for which it was designed.
Vamos a ver entonces cómo viene. Entonces, con el cierre de esta vela, señora, nos estaremos despidiendo de nuestro en vivo. Todavía Powell, al pobre Powell lo tienen todavía ahí, sin agua, sin café y sin almuerzo. Pobrecito. Pobre Powell. Vamos a ver entonces cómo se vienen entonces los movimientos para después que Powell abre. Mira, ahí la otra vela abre. Ya usted puede tener más o menos una idea de que el precio entonces está dentro del canal todavía. Todavía hay esperanza que estamos dentro del canal, todavía hay esperanza de que estamos dentro del canal, ¿verdad? Estamos ahí dentro del canal. Así que vamos a ver qué sucede. Vamos a ver qué se desarrolla en las próximas horas de negociación de este mercado. ¿Ok? Un abrazo para todos. Feliz Día de la Mujer a todas las hermosas mujeres de esta academia y del mundo en general, a nuestras madres, hermanas, amigas, primas, tías, abuela y todo en general, Un feliz día, espero que estés pasándola bien, disfrútalo, aprovecha, pide lo que quieras, pide un deseo hoy y que celebren un hermoso día contigo. Un abrazo para todos. Nos vemos entonces esta noche. Hablemos un poquito de futuros esta noche y analicemos entonces qué pasó con esta jornada de hoy y qué es lo que se nos viene para fin de esta semana y para ir ya mirando tentativamente próxima semana. Para ir mirando tentativamente, señores, ya próxima semana que viene cargada de muchos reportes. De muchos reportes, ¿ok? Un abrazo para todos, muchas bendiciones y que tengan un excelente
Larry Summers wrote an op-ed before they spent the money and said it was going to cause inflation, and he has gone on the I was right tour for the last couple years.